Thank you all for being here for our meeting. How are you doing this morning?
Jerry got back late last night.
Let's quiet down. The newspaper is causing disorder over there, Mr.
That's not unusual.
Yeah, that would be good. That would be good. Well, thank you all for being here today. We're still waiting on Greg and Tad, but I think we ought to get started. As far as I know, they'll be here. I just want to thank all of y'all for your patience and your diligence, and thank David and Jonathan for their work. This is going to take some patience, and I'm sorry that we didn't get the work out last week, but I'm so grateful that Pew has the internal reviews that they have, because I think it improves the work and hopefully made it more understandable for y'all. So I sent out the agenda last night, and what I'm hoping that we'll do is have a very short presentations from Michael and Jonathan and me on just to explain briefly the papers that you got and hopefully have fully digested, and then really move right into the discussion of really the four areas which we really have identified as what we need to do. So that when we leave here today, we will have come to not final consensus, but really have narrowed our focus so that we can see where we're headed at least, and Pew can begin modeling on a more specific basis of where we are. So I hope that that's okay with y'all. So let's get started. Why don't we start with Bob Miller? Why don't you introduce yourself so it gets on the record? This is all being recorded.
Okay, I'm Bob Miller. I'm the CFO with Family Support Services.
Greg Smith, President, Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, Northeast Florida, and 2013 Chamber Chair.
Gwen Yates, retired, member of the task force.
Bob Sheridan, retired businessman.
Chester Akins, dentist/lawyer, member of the task force.
Sherry McGill, Jesse Waldepont Fund, member of the task force.
John Thompson with Wells Fargo Advisors.
David Bohr with CSX.
Kelly O'Leary with the HCI Group.
Bill Shy, Rogers Towers.
Carl Cannon, retired publisher of the Florida Times-Union.
John Wilbanks, Baptist Health.
Bill Rupp from Mayo Clinic.
Tad Delegal, attorney.
Kirsten Doolittle, attorney.
Charlie Appleby, Advanced Disposal Services.
Great. Well, thank you all. And David and Jonathan, why don't y'all, I don't know who's going to go first, but if y'all would just give us a brief, whatever you want to say, knowing that everybody has read these, and thank y'all again for your work. And we're grateful to Pew for being with us and supporting us. So, welcome.
Thank you and good morning. Thank you, Bill, for having us here. Thank you to the task force for your work on this incredibly important issue. Once again, I'm David Drain from the Pew Charitable Trust. Here is part of our joint project with the Laura and John Owen Foundation to help improve public policy on public sector retirement systems. I'm going to try to go over my slides quickly. That being said, for better or worse, it's very background, so we'll do the best that we can. Between my presentation and our colleague Jonathan Richards, we want to cover three areas. First, how is Jacksonville going to pay down its pension debt? Second, considering new plan options for the Jacksonville Police and Fire Pension Fund. And third, some selected issues on governance and investment practices. Paying down policymakers, so the task force, the mayor's office, city council, there's really three options for dealing with the existing pension fund. You can cut spending and use that money you saved to put into the pension fund. You can raise revenue, either taxes or other fees, and you can ask current employees to contribute more. And whatever Jacksonville decides to do, there needs to be a credible plan to pay down the pension debt without threatening key government services, without forcing unsustainable tax increases, or without breaking the promise to workers and retirees. And just like paying a credit card bill, the faster Jacksonville is able to do this, the lower the total cost will be. This is simply the baseline that we've been working on. These are status quo costs if things continue as they are. The dark blue line is nominal dollars. So in 2036, Jacksonville projected to need to spend about $400 million on PFDF costs. And then the lighter blue line is inflation adjusted. So, in 2013 dollars, it'll be closer to $200 million in 2036. The bulk of these costs are really for the unfunded liability for the pension debt. And you can see what happens in 2038 when that debt's finally paid off and costs drop dramatically. So right now, Jacksonville.
Remember that we've read it, so just really see through it. Thanks.
So right now, Jacksonville's on a slow path towards paying down its pension debt. And there's really two ways that Jacksonville can either speed up that process or make it a little easier. And the first one is making some sort of one-time contribution, putting some amount into the system right now for a couple of years to bolster the funding level, to reduce costs going forward. Options I've been discussing include pension obligation bonds, include real estate sales, selling other assets, or a one-time tax increase or a one-time spending cut. We modeled a one-time contribution of $100 million. And we found that the net savings would have been about $67 million over the course of paying down the pension debt. And really this is in part from putting money in that the pension fund can invest and get returns on, and as a result, getting those savings. This is just a projection of that. And this is, we built the modeling tool so we can, as proposals are made, $200 million up fronts, ongoing payments of whatever, we're able to model that, we're able to project.
Let me interrupt that, because when David and I talked, so that y'all know today, as we throw out ideas, he's going to have that ability to model it as we speak. So.
And the second, beyond one-time payments, is finding a way to do ongoing payments. And there's really two things you can do with that. One is simply bringing in new money to offset the cost of the other payments, the required contributions. So paying it off on the current schedule, but giving yourself some budgetary, or giving the city some budgetary room. And the other option is bringing money in to try to pay down the bill faster, to go above and beyond the arc and reduce both the effective interest you're going to have to be paying on that. And so we modeled an ongoing contribution of $90 million. We did it so that half that contribution, $45 million, is simply substituting for the ARC payment that the city would have already made. And the other half, the other $45 million, is above and beyond the ARC to pay down the debt faster. And since, this is simply the impact of that, there's higher costs in the short run, because Jacksonville will be committing to pay above and beyond the ARC, but relatively quickly you start to see those gains, you start to see those savings, and the average rate is substantially easier for the city. Finally, there's been some proposals to find ways to have shared sacrifice. Some of the things that are proposed include increasing employee contributions, changing COLAs, modifying the job plan, changing the benefit formula going forward. The vast bulk of the existing liabilities, the existing unfunded liabilities, are for benefits that have already been promised and can't be changed. That being said, at least on employee contributions and COLAs, there is Florida precedent for making some changes to those going forward. And similarly, there's been existing proposals, such as civic councils, that change benefits going forward. The second piece, plan design. So we wanted to model the different options we've either been hearing about in Jacksonville, or that were specifically requested of us by the task force and by others to look at. Before we get into that, there's 4 components of a good, effective retirement system. Fully funded benefits, giving every worker a secure path to retirement, having professionally managed low-fee investments, and having access to annuities. Whatever system that Jacksonville chooses, whatever plan design that it chooses, it needs to have all 4 of those things. So really, what the task force needs to ask is, and answer for itself, is what is the best way for Jacksonville to provide retirement benefit for public employees, and which of these plan designs are going to be affordable, sustainable, and secure over the long run? We looked at 6 different plans. 3 of them are defined benefit, traditional defined benefit plans, including a proposal made in the immediate settlement agreement, the Civic Council's proposal, and looking at the benefits offered under the Florida retirement system to new public safety workers. Just to make clear on the FRS modeling, this is not looking at joining FRS, this is simply looking at what would happen because those exact same benefits can apply to Jacksonville. And finally, we're asked to look at 3 different alternative plan designs: a defined contribution plan and 2 hybrid designs, including a stacked hybrid, where there's a smaller DB alongside a defined contribution plan, and a cash balance plan. So first, we looked at what the current plan is. You need to have a baseline about what you currently have. Here's the benefit provisions, and here's the benefits one gets over time. Just to go over what this chart shows, because there'll be 6 other charts like it, this is looking at the present value of earned retirement benefits. So for an employee who starts at age 25, each year we look at what is the value of the benefits he or she has accrued already. So this not only includes the actual benefits you get, but how many years, the calculation factors in how many years you're going to get it, whether or not there's a COLA, whether or not there's spousal benefits, all those pieces. So, for example, at on age 43, we project that the employee has about $400,000 worth of pension benefits that he or she has already earned and is entitled to. And the reason we show these is it helps you answer 2 questions. First, how do plans compare to each other in generosity? So simply put, if there's a higher number of one plan than on the other, that plan is going to be more generous, factoring in all those pieces. And then second, how are benefits earned over a career? You see there's a fairly low set of benefits for the first 15 years or so, then there's a steep rise, then it flattens out a bit, and then once you're no longer eligible for the drop, there's this steep decline in benefits. So this is the benefits under the mediated settlement agreement. Notice here that there's an even flatter portion at the beginning and then a steep increase. This is because of the provision that if you leave before the full 30 years of service, you end up having to delay your retirement for a number of years and you get a smaller benefit. So once you work long enough to get past that, then the value of your benefits increases rapidly. Here's a picture of the Civic Council plan. Florida retirement system benefits for new workers. One thing to clarify about this, unlike the other plans, so all 6 plans we looked at, we project to have about 10% employer costs. So that the cost of providing new workers will be about 10% of payroll. For the FRS benefits, which we're modeling, on the employee contributions are only 3%. So these benefits are a little less generous than the others we're looking at. The employee costs are also answered. Defined contribution plan. So the 3 defined benefit plans all had fairly low periods of the early years, fairly high periods in the later years. Plans more like a defined contribution plan end up having a more smooth benefit path. Now this may be good or this may be bad depending on Jacksonville's needs. On one hand, workers who spend 10 or 15 years are able to, in the police or fire services, are able to leave with a better benefit, giving them a better path to retirement security. At the same time, this may be hurting your ability to retain those skilled people, and you may lose out on that retention goal. So I just wanted to, there's different plan designs and they have different benefit paths for workers, and those differences really can matter for recruitment and retention. So that should be part of how the task force looks at this. The other important thing about something like a defined contribution plan is, unlike how traditional pension plans are typically run, all the risk is put onto the worker. So the employer will have very stable contributions under the system, but the benefit line depends on what the investments and other factors that go into it, and what workers could actually get could be greater or lesser than that. Cash balance plan, this is something very similar to a defined contribution plan, but it contains 2 of the key protections commonly associated with traditional pension First, workers get a guaranteed return. In this case, the one we looked at, workers are going to, we model workers get a guaranteed 4% investment return on their accounts each and every year. If long-term returns are above that, they manage to get 3/4 of the upside. So it means that there's a certain basic level of protection where not only do worker accounts never shrink, regardless of what the economy does, but they grow at a fixed rate every year. Secondly, built-in access to annuities. We talked briefly about this at the beginning of these 4 principles of good plan design. Having access to annuities, lifetime benefits that never run out, is critical to any effective retirement tool. Defined contribution plans don't inherently have that access. So if Jacksonville chooses to go that way, we would strongly recommend that that gets built in. Cash balance plans do have that built in. And finally, a stacked hybrid plan. This is a design that a number of states and cities have used. It simply says, we want a plan that combines some aspects of the defined benefit plan and combines some aspects of the defined contribution plan. Let's just match 2 of them together. So you have a smaller defined benefit, so giving that guaranteed retirement savings for the worker. But it's going to be smaller, so there's less risk to the employer. And then the other piece is going to be a defined contribution component with that riskiness, with that moving up. So this intellectually confusing slide is just all those plans put together. I think the most useful thing to get out of this is that, mediated settlement proposal, the city council plan, switching to FRS benefits, the alternative approaches, they're all substantial cuts from where Jacksonville currently is with PFPF benefits. This is just those 6 plans on their own. I think the thing that would be good to get from this slide is when you look at the 3 alternative plans and their smooth benefit accruals, so the yellow line, the dotted blue, and the dashed orange, those 3 benefit accruals look pretty similar to each other. And then defined benefit plans, they've got that flat and then that spike. And depending on which is going to be better for Jacksonville's workforce goals, that should help inform decisions. And even within the defined benefit options that we propose, you can see there's actually a pretty big difference in what they look like for a worker over their career. So the red line is the immediate settlement proposal plan, once again with that very low benefit for the first 25 years of service, and then that sustained increase. Dash purple is civic council plan. This is smoother over a career. And finally, the blue is FRS. So extending out somewhere in between of those 2 plans. So once again, the question is, which of these plans, of these 6 options, are going to be the best at providing retirement security for public employees and giving the right workforce incentives? Jacksonville gets the public safety workers that it needs. And then, which plan will be affordable and sustainable over the long term?
Great. Greg has a question. Let's don't bog down in questions now because they're going to be available as we go through our discussion, too.
Okay, just a quick take. What did you assume for salary increases in your model?
We use the Jacksonville salary scale.
And looking at these costs and the non-traditional kind of plans, did you factor in anything like the increased cost of turnover or to the city or cost of vested employees in the current system leaving?
No, but obviously that's, really want to reemphasize what you think the impacts are going to be on the workforce need to be a key consideration of choosing between these 6 different plan designs.
Okay, so these are all assuming essentially the same cost in each plan. It's just which model we're looking at and which would be more advantageous for the city. Is that right?
Yeah, and the other piece of it is that for a smoother accrual plan, so going back to civic council plan versus MSP, the civic council plan, because a worker can't know how long he or she is going to stay, civic council plan might be more beneficial for recruitment. At the same time, that, 15 or 20-year worker can leave with more, and as a result, they may be detrimental to retention. So recruitment and retention are the very important goals. The one plan that might be best for one may not work perfectly for the other.
Yep. Good. Yep, sure.
Well, do you have any actual studies of actual experience of cities that, on retention and recruitment?
There's a number of studies that have looked at various, what happens when you give things like early retirement incentives or things that are designed to change retention behavior and, effectively to push people out. There's not really good studies that we've seen comparing. And one thing we're going to look at is, for example, police and fire workers in Texas are under a cash balance benefit. Do they have differences in their ability to recruit and retain? At the same time, there's a lot of other things going on, in any sort of comparison between, say, Texas and any peer city or state.
Haven't there been a few pension plans around the country that have gone to defined contributions and then have gone back to defined benefit because of the turnover cost?
It wasn't over the turnover cost, but there's two states that had defined contribution plans that switched. West Virginia went to a defined contribution plan as part of their efforts to look at their retirement policies and decided that it wasn't meeting their case, their teachers' needs, and went back. And then Nebraska had a defined contribution plan for many years, and in 2002 decided that that wasn't serving as an effective retirement vehicle and switched to a cash balance plan. Actually, the thing that, certainly in Nebraska's case, that really drove this, and if Jacksonville decides to go down a defined contribution route, in Nebraska, people in the DC plan just were not given good or the appropriate investment options. People broadly chose the very safe approach that was heavily weighted towards very low return investments. They weren't accruing a substantial benefit, and they decided that keeping that basic structure, but managing the money for them, helping them get annuities, those pieces were really going to be much more effective at giving them retirement security.
Is there a cost comparison on making the change to any of the proposed plans? Because I saw the costs prior to change, but can you show a cost comparison with all of the changes? And my guess is over 30 years, it's very minimal.
Well, I guess, so the current employer cost for new benefits is about 30% of payroll. Projected costs for new benefits for any of these plans is about 10%. So any of them would, over time, result in some real cost savings, saving 20% of payrolls. That's a substantial amount. That being said, any sort of new plan change is going to take time for the for the current cohorts to switch over, and so it's going to be a while before you see those savings.
Well, and the savings is really our big focus, right? So it would be important to know how those compare on a savings basis. And I don't mean to backtrack too much, but on the pay down of the debt, I'm curious what actuaries recommend in terms of a reasonable time frame to pay down the debt, because when you shorten that time frame, it's a considerable squeeze on the city, and I'd like to know what best practices are, and I think our actuary is here to perhaps address that, along with some other questions about risks of how we pay it down.
Let's hold these until we get into what we're discussing, because we're going to discuss all that, because we really need to spend some time talking among ourselves. But they're here, and so as that comes up, that'd be an appropriate time to raise that. Okay? Anything else? Thank you, David. Jonathan?
Well, thank you, and looking forward to your questions later on.
Great.
I don't know, Bill, if
Yep, we do, and everybody's read it thoroughly.
So why don't we go over it quickly? So I'm here to talk about, I guess, two things today: governance and investment practices. And it's important to understand, and I'll try not to read the bullets directly because we've all read it. It's great. Ask questions about it later. Think about it. It's important to recognize here when we talk about governance and investment practices, your guide guidelines that govern investment practices. We're not talking about anything that will impact the plan from a beneficiary standpoint. These are things that shouldn't impact the plan at all from a beneficiary standpoint. And implemented to prevent future or safeguard the assets on a go-forward basis. Sure. Is Mike on? Okay, I'll try to project a little bit better. I'm sorry. So there's research also that shows that effective governance does lead to better performance of the fund. And it's important in general, especially in the public pension space, that you pay attention to governance, because there are really very few criteria that you can point to objectively that all stakeholders will agree to measure performance. Goes to additional oversight. For instance, not all stakeholders in all places even think that public pension funds should be funded at 100%, which is you're young and looking for a career and don't want to see your goals so high. Public pension is the place to go, I guess. On slide 1, I talk about transparency. This is really a key. It's something that few stresses, and they couldn't be more correct than they do. And it's something that, when it comes to the PFPF, can be improved and should be improved. And I think that's a clear-cut case. We all know the expression, sunshine is the best disinfectant. We agree. I think the minimum or best practices that we would recommend on that include actuarial evaluation annually. I think it's a no-brainer. Also, potentially using alternative funding scenarios in the actuarial evaluations or in CAPR, base case, worst case, and best case. Don't forget these 30-year projections rely on basic actuarial assumptions and investment performance assumptions. So there's going to be a lot of variability, but all of those assumptions, when you look at actuary, when actuary thinks about that, are done on a stable 7% or 6% basis annually. And that's not going to happen smoothly. And so a best case, worst case, and base case is always a good idea. At least you compare for them what happens in the worst case. People aren't surprised that that's a possibility. Also, consistent actuarial methods, right? We talked about what happens when you change how a fund values its assets and potentially immediately recognize sharp gains in the market and then lengthen out recognition of sharp losses. That can lead to asymmetry in reporting, which could, especially if actuarial evaluations aren't going manually, surprise if you sneak up and show an unfunded liability that didn't expect coming. Also, if a fund doesn't report its assets or uses smoothing mechanisms, continue to use those smoothing mechanisms throughout, but even so, should show the market value assets. That's something that's probably going to have to happen when we get it. Forms take hold, but that should be a best practice. Also, employer cost projections a few years out is helpful for cities to plan their costs. No reason why they couldn't. That plans couldn't assume they can arrange either a city or the employer an estimate of what the annual cost would be. And then, of course, the normal cost should be listed every year, because the normal cost is really represents the true present value of benefits as they accrue. And in the case that where you have reforms and you create a new tier of employees, which has happened elsewhere and may happen here, then you should list the normal cost by tier. Finally, investment return reports are very important. Best practice to put them out quarterly and also relative to assumptions, benchmarks, and even comparable funds over the same time period. And the reason we stress quarterly is because a lot of funds report on different fiscal years. There are a lot of funds on different fiscal years. The PFPF is on a 30th fiscal year. That's not the norm. I'm proper about that. But if you report quarterly, then you better see how PFPF is doing relative to other funds. And finally, again, disclosure, utilize technology to warehouse these things online for public scrutinize. So moving on to slide 2, when we talk about proper governance, we should point out and keep in mind that the board is really the primary facilitator of governance for most public pension systems. And the trustees serve as the fiduciaries in that respect. They set investment strategies, they approve implementation, they oversee performance, management, and risk, and they really set the guidelines. They don't run the day-to-day. Its makeup and composition is key to the success of a pension fund, obviously. The PFPF has 5 board members, 2 are appointed by labor, 2 are appointed by the city council, at the moment, voted on by the 4 members that are appointed by the council and labor. The GFOA talks about an optimal size, a little larger, being from 7 to 13 members. They don't really back up that recommendation well. Group dynamic studies say that 6 to 7 members is best for collective decision-making, whereas larger numbers, obviously always, this is not just the case of public pensions, but will expand a board's expertise or allow for potential expansion of board expertise. And there should be value in that for any public pension fund, because most public funds have a fixed number of active or retired workers, public workers that are members of the board, and they may not have direct and relevant experience, although certainly they have a reason to be on the board nonetheless, but the expansion of board membership could at least expand expertise in an area which is arcane, this stuff is hard. Finally, if you have smaller numbers, if any of you certain boards know for an extended period of time, you can get bogged down in committees, right? And so there's something to be said that a sweet spot might be around 9, and we could subdivide a 9 among 3 subcommittees with 3 members, and so it can be overlapped. But there's no perfect number by any means. It's more important that there's efficacy on the board than you've got the right perfect number. And to help with efficacy, I think the best practice would likely be at least conduct an inventory of board skills to help or at least think about a fit for purpose board. So slide 4, I start talking about investment practices a little bit. This, there are 8 best practices that we can talk about when they think about how public pensions are implement investment practices. The first is just to establish the rationale for investing, the goals, and make sure the plan abides by that. And that, of course, is the board's responsibility. It should be an inclusive purpose mission, right? Solely for the purpose of plan participants and providing funds or benefits to participants. The key to that is the asset allocation. That's the most important decision there. And therefore, a board should conduct regular studies on the proper asset balance, including the proper diversifications, including within classes. So diversify not only among stocks and bonds, but among particular classes of asset classes. So real estate, diversified by geography, as an example. Key counterbalancing consideration is always risk and risk exposure, and that should be matched with liabilities, your cash flow requirements considered when you deploy your assets. The second of the 8 best practices or so is just clear definitions of the roles of key decision makers. Those should be clear. We talked a little bit about the board already, so let's just move, external investment consultants. These are outside service providers normally, and they offer independent perspective and analysis of the fund. They should review asset allocation performance. They should make recommendations to the board. They should assist with the selection of external money managers, and they should also help very much in reporting and provide quarterly reports and commentary on the total portfolio and performance by asset class, also individual managers, which is track. The money managers are also key decision makers, and they should invest the assets according to laws, guidelines, but also their mandates, and they should report results quarterly as well. The plan staff and senior fund management, they organize, they administer the fund, they take care of day-to-day operations of the system, they take care of operational budgets, and that role should be defined clearly as well. The standard of care should be defined, whether or not you're talking about a proven person or a proven expert, should be articulated and explicit. The asset allocation statement should be clear, and changes should be posted, or studies show that the solution asset allocation should be disclosed. They should dictate how assets are deployed, such that the fund meets future liabilities or potential fluctuations. It's also have diversification already. And it should also weigh in on active versus passive deployment of assets, with an emphasis on passive and highly efficient market. And finally, it should say something about economically targeted investments and alternatives fall into that category, because a lot of funds want to invest in this, and therefore there should be clear criteria as to when a public pension fund dip their toes into the alternative investment class. Obviously, a lot of risk, it's liquid, so there's special considerations made here. It's hard to monitor, specialized. So the GFOA actually has some recommended criteria. They're pretty good, and they should be articulated. I think funds are articulated as part of the cover. Slide 6, we talk about specifically alternative investments. Again, the GFO offers excellent advice for how a public pension fund should approach these investments. We don't need to go through them one by one. But I should say, just for how we think about things, I should point out that there should be an expansion of due diligence by the fund if you're going to go into an alternative. It should be obvious. And therefore, you need to take into account fund's expertise and ability to organize and monitor and be prudent when it comes to risk here, illiquid investments like that. There should also be disciplined rebalancing of assets, right? Especially with a small fund like the FDF, relatively. So a large fund, it's not crazy to rebalance once a year if you're a large fund. First of all, you're an FRS, you're a $100 million plus fund, it's hard. That's a hard thing to do. And also you can withstand volatility here. So it's not necessarily as urgent as it might be for a $1 billion fund, where it's easier to do. Not easy, but easier. And also you're more susceptible to volatility. So your asset targets will go out of whack in a volatile market like today. You should be rebalancing. Best practice is not keep things probably for small fund. Okay, let's just move on to slide 7. Reporting and monitoring of key money managers. We talked about them reporting quarterly. External investment advisors, they really, one of their core chores is that monitoring process and disclosure. The annual reports should be much more robust than the quarterly reports. They should include performance based upon benchmarks, gross and net of fees. They should also list compounded annual growth of the last year, the last 3 years, the last 5 years, the last 10 years. And performance should be compared to the assigned benchmark for the total portfolio for each asset class and also for each money manager, gross and net of fees.
Can we put a time limit on speakers? You know, don't hurt to see on my part, but to listen for 15 to 20 minutes for a droll of words and words.
Well, this is for the task force, not the public. Jonathan, do speed this up because I would like to get into
That's
that.
a fair point. And finally, funds should set their guidelines and proxies. Slide 8 points out that the PFPF is relying heavily on active investment strategies and managers, and that might obviously have been influencing costs. I'll talk about that in slide 8. Slide 9, the PFPF has expressed a desire to invest in additional alternative asset classes. It's already invested in real estate, which is an alternative asset class. It's a reasonable one. And this chart, on slide 9, the chart shows the fund would likely need to shift about 9% of its current assets, or its assets as of the date that I pulled that data, to alternatives if they wanted to mirror FRS, which is potentially something desirable. The 9% would equate to about $90 million of PFPF's assets based on those data. I know there's more current data, the fund assets may be higher, 1.3 billion, 9% of that would be about 170 million, but it's the same general directional area. We're talking about between 90 and $117 million in assets that PFPF would have for alternative investments. What's key here is that the FRS, when you think about its alternative investment class or asset allocation, being so much larger, can give out mandates of $100 million a clip, and that provides access to top-performing private equity and hedge funds. Whereas, for the same diversification, or if you want to diversify your alternative assets over a number of funds, because again, risk is key here, risk is at a premium. You're talking about, for PFPF, likely mandates of $5 or $10 million if you wanted to allocate your assets over 50 or 20 private equity or hedge funds. And that would not allow a smaller fund access to top-performing private equity and hedge funds. So what you'd be looking at as an option would be emerging funds, which is hugely risky, or funded funds, which is expensive. And so it's hard for a smaller fund to replicate the performance of a larger fund in the alternative space. And let me just also say that the FRS alternatives have been very good. I looked at their performance returns over the past 3 years and 5-year periods, which they disclosed, and they've done very well in their alternative portfolio. Let's see, let's go to slide 13, or slide 12. So speaking of FRS, we looked at this because we were a little impressed as we started to go down to Jacksonville and kind of look around and wanted to see how they did things, and we were really impressed. So we thought we'd take some time to point out how FRS is managed in order to do this as a test case. The State Board of Administration, or the SBA, they manage the FRS investments, as you may know, and it has nothing to do with the administration of the fund. There's a division of responsibilities there. That's on the Florida Division of Retirement. The board is made up of 3 trustees. They're all elected officials, and they are fiduciary members of the fund. They do all the things that we talked about, or I talked about in my talk, which is the one for some people, or in terms of setting guidelines, etc. And they also, go to slide 13, they also are key participants and or rather, part of the system, right, is that they ultimately appoint an independent investment advisory committee. The 3 board members appoint 3 members each, and the IAC at the FRS level has, it's an interesting construct, and I think an effective one, and it seems to work well for them. It's, so it's 9 professionals and experts who act as basically the eyes and ears of board members when it comes to investment practices. And they meet quarterly, they review ideas, studies, and preferences from the board and also from the FRS staff. And by statute, they have to opine publicly on changes in investment policies and investment statements, as well as asset allocations that are proposed by FRS and staff. And so they opine on it and it's public. And why is that important? Because if the board goes against it, well, okay, the ISE recommended one thing, the board said something else, the board is entirely, all the decision making is with the board, but at least with a public record of a prudent counter opinion. And this is all available in warehouse on the FRS website. It's also broadcast live, a webcast, is my understanding. And the effect is that the FRS gets to borrow the wisdom of other professional financial experts without keeping up any of their duties, without being replaced. Okay, let's go to slide 14. The FRS has robust internal controls. They've got investment consultants that play a very active role in selecting money managers. Their council plays a role in selecting money managers. And the FRS annual investment report lists every fund that is invested in, or every money manager, and returned by every money manager, by each money manager. You can also actually get the fees by asset class, and you can get the fees of individual money managers, although that's not public, but evidently it's easily accessible if you put in a request. Let's see, they've got an internal audit department where the trustees appoint a member to the audit committee, and the audit committee can ask for audit on anything all year. And my understanding is that there's several hundred audits over the past several years. And finally, there's an outside audit. Slide 15, FRS relies on low-cost passive strategies, or when they can, or passively managed funds, and they believe, and I'll talk to them, they believe that they can consistently beat their benchmarks, largely due to good manager selection and then low-cost index funds where efficient. They also have a relatively low alternative asset allocation. Interesting. So they're into their peers, talking about the fifth largest public pension fund in the country now, and their peers are the seventh or so largest. They do consider, well, let's skip to slide 16, because I'm not taking long, and I apologize. One thing we wanted to talk about is the potential idea of what the PFTF could do, given that we understand there's a challenge, which is the PFTF board might be changing that, might require legislation, a political fight, or amendment of the city charter, engagement in a referendum. And so there is a potential to mimic, or at least look at the FRS, for example, as a way to supplement the existing PFTF board expertise without disrupting the current structure. And an investment advisory committee could do that. It can help professionalize financial oversight and investment activities. It could be a volunteer, appointees, if you could find civic-minded people in Jacksonville, which there are, with the expertise that can help us out. And then the rest of that slide talks about ways in which it can be implemented or work as a way to ultimately leave final ultimate decision-making with the board, but supply an extra layer of oversight and financial expertise that the board can draw from. And so I think I will end there.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. Any questions of Jonathan? John?
In the spirit of narrowing options, remind us what the downsides or prohibitions would be of these funds commingling with the FRS. You've given it as model, but what keeps us from doing it that?
It sounds like FRS. I mean, has the city or anyone really approached FRS? It has an understanding from talking with you, it's not been done in the past. Would you take a heavy lift?
There may be some, I recall from one of our earlier meetings that FRS was not able statutorily to invest other funds, so there's a legal impediment to that.
And our rolling into FRS is not an option either.
If we did that, as I recall, that would have a big impact on the unfunded liability, that would accelerate that.
So in theory, if FRS were to swallow the fund, at least in theory, because there's statute limitations, there might have to be a political will, and FRS and the Board of Trustees would have to accept this as fiduciaries to their own fund. They'd have to take a fund with unfunded liabilities, and how they would value that would be differently than how the PFTF is currently valuing that, and they would charge the city accordingly. So it's more complicated than just
So in the spirit of narrowing options, that's not.
That's really not. Jim Lynn is here. I think, did we sort of summarize the impediments there?
Legally, there would have to be a change in the state statutes.
Right.
The Board retirement system does not assume local retirement.
Okay. Okay, that's a good point. Right. Right. Cindy, anything to add to that?
I mean, just if we have the choice to go into the FRS, they manage by allowing all of us at any time to go in going forward, but that's inconsistent
Right.
with their mission.
So going forward would be with new employees, for example, might.
The mission Mr. Lynn and the actuary looked at legally possible to put new employees in going forward, and that's how FRS works. You can come into theirs, but they don't touch anybody else.
Okay. Okay, great. Okay, we'll come back to this in a little bit. I wanted to go over briefly the governance issues. I'm not going to go through it. Just to give you my thoughts about it, I thought it was very important that to me, it had never been understood explained how we got to where we are. So I thought that it was important So we spent a lot of time on this. I want to thank Steve Durden and Jim Lynn for helping on this, and Cindy to some extent. But so this tells you how we got to where we are. It also suggests that because we are deemed to comply plan, because we were in existence before 1939, and I know Ted, I know there's some disagreement about that, but assuming that for the moment, that there are a number of alternatives that we have the power to do, including changing the membership, amending the charter. The conclusion of this paper is that if the legislature can amend the charter, but if the council were to do it, the likelihood would be that we would need a referendum to do that also, given the charter provisions in Article 3. That's a little open, but so we have a lot of power. And talking with Jim this morning, if we decide that it would be good for the city and for the fund, I mean, we really we want to reach an agreement. So we're not just imposing this. We want to say if the trustees and the administrator of the fund felt that maybe more board members would be a good thing, then we would have the power, because we, as a city, because we are deemed to comply, that we could enlarge the board, which I didn't realize before.
Can I say a little bit about that? And I understand what Jim's statement was, that this is a decision or an interpretation by the Division of Retirement. Those interpretations change, and a good part of my practice is challenging people in government who make the wrong interpretations. And looking at that statute, I think it's pretty clear that that interpretation is wrong. It may be binding right now, but that's a $10 million bet that somebody who goes into that position next year is not going to come out with another interpretation, because the statute clearly, I mean, the deeming issue deals with whether or not your benefits are in compliance with state statutes.
Yep.
But that's a separate issue from whether or not, in my opinion, whether or not you get what is now about $10 million
the chapter funds. Right.
And if you look at that statute, I don't see how the department came to the conclusion that came.
Let's discuss that in the discussion period. I just want to give an overview. But there are ways to amend the charter that are set forth in the charter. I've tried to lay those out for you. There's a whole section on the role of the general counsel, which I hope y'all read, that relates to the amount of fees and the control of what judgments are utilized in connection with litigation. It picks up on some of what both Jonathan and David said in terms of actuarial reports, the investment committee. It raises the issue of the seeming conflict of interest, where you have an administrator that is the advocate for the planned beneficiaries, as it administers it without a corresponding duty to the city that is providing the funds. The statute is pretty clear that there is no such duty to the city. The fiduciary responsibilities, as I read the statute, were to the planned beneficiaries. But that doesn't mean that there's not an ethical issue that we need to at least make some recommendations about. The 30-year agreement, the length of that's been the subject of particularly the Civic Council. It seems to me that the 30-year agreement sort of fades into the background a little bit if we have the power to amend through the city council or the legislature. That's just an issue. But it sort of fades a little bit in my mind. And finally, the section on bankruptcy, which sort of puts that to bed in terms of Jacksonville's context, because we have a financial situation that's pretty stable. We have a lot of capacity in our taxation, which despite the letter to the editor this morning, I'm not advocating anything with respect to tax increases now. I may end up that way, but bankruptcy is not an option. The Detroit case was just decided this week, at least initially by the bankruptcy court, and that gives some power to the argument about municipal bankruptcy, but we're in an entirely different position now. So I just wanted to go over that with y'all. And any questions about that? And then we can move right into our discussion. Okay? So let's try to stay focused on what we identified earlier as really the four big areas. And the first is the unfunded liability. What do we do about it? We've had a lot of different proposals from real estate to pension bonds to payments over, enlarged payments over a term. So how can we inform each other about this so that we can then narrow what we are thinking about so Pew could then model it going forward? And that's the question. I know Jonathan said the greater decision-making was in 6 to 7 members of a committee, so if 10 of you would like to resign, so we'll have, I won't receive them, but, and anyways. So the floor for the task force now is open for discussion about, well, what are your thoughts about the unfunded liability? So.
You know, Bill, I had mentioned it earlier, what do actuaries of pension plans like this recommend in terms of paying down the unfunded liability? Because we all may have an opinion, but if there is a professional standard, we need to know about it.
Yep. Bob, Robert, what do actuaries have to say about that?
Let me, I get one of David's slides, put that up here.
Sure.
Make my life a little bit easier. The one that showed the city contributions for the next 30 years. I think this is the one that probably you were referring to. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Robert Suzuki from Millen, I'm the actuary for the city, not for the police and fire board. What is here is that the actuary in 2012 took all the unfunded liability and said, we're going to pay it off over 23 years. And the payments are going up at 3.25% a year. And so you can see the curve goes steadily up, and then in 23 years, which is about 2036, the unfunded liability in theory is gone, and the city contributions go way down. You can argue whether or not that's fair to a different generation of taxpayers, to the city budget. But this was a change in 2012. The Police and Fire Board and the actuary probably have a better idea of why they did it. But prior to this, in 2011 and earlier years, what they were doing is every time they did evaluation, they set up a 30-year base. And so instead of just one big mortgage, which is a 23-year mortgage, they had a series of mortgages. Each one was 30 years. The original one was 40 years. So when they did the 2011 valuation, they had maybe 15 or 20 mortgages. One had 1 year remaining, the next one had 4 years remaining, the next one had 7 years remaining. So if you want to say a disadvantage of that is you don't have a smooth curve. You have a curve that oscillates up and down because each mortgage can be plus or minus. In my mind, that is a better way to do it because you don't have a severe cliff. This also is assuming there's no more gains and losses. We don't know what the police and fire actuary will do another valuation, maybe 2013, maybe 2014. You know, their pattern has been erratic. I don't know if he's going to continue this, in which case it would drop, be even more severe, or he would start new 30-year basis.
So this would not be your recommended way of analyzing the pension liability?
No.
Okay.
No.
So with that in mind, it may benefit the committee to understand the many variables that go into this analysis, which include mortality, they include retirement dates that people actually retire compared to what is expected. It includes the performance of the fund, which is variable. It includes also property taxes, which are going to offset some of these potential costs in the future. And we know properties tend to rise over time a little bit more than inflation. So there's a number of other factors to consider, and this is probably the scariest chart to look at, wouldn't you say?
I would, I think, and my gut feeling tells me the curve is probably even more severe than you're seeing there.
Okay.
So what would be to piggyback on John's question, what would your recommendation be? And as I recall, and Jim, the statute, when reading the statute permits a 30-year amortization of the unfunded liability. Is that right? So you can, and is that 30 years each actuarial report? You can go out,
The state says each phase can be 30, it's supposed to be no more than 30 years from each valuation.
Okay.
So that's why you could have different layers, and one's at 30 years, your older one would be at 27 years remaining, your one before that might be at 25 or whenever you did the prior valuation.
Okay.
I like that. I mean, it doesn't give you a smooth, from a budgeting point of view, it doesn't give you a smooth curve up or down. It's going to go fluctuate, oscillate up and down, but it won't have a severe drop-off that you have there, which bothers me a lot. I mean, I don't live in Jacksonville, but I live in a different county, and, that tells me that my taxes now are going for the pension plan, and my kids are going to have better schools or something.
Well, I think if we had a chart that showed our expected tax base at a minimal rise in the rate of real estate, how that would compare to that, and certainly that will be slightly higher, but not as considerable as we might estimate. The other issue that I think we definitely need to talk about, and I don't think it's been brought up, is the process by which the actuary for the Police and Fire Pension Fund puts together their analysis, how the city's actuary has to agree to that, and then how the state has to confirm that, the politics involved in that, and even hearing from you, you already don't agree with the other actuary. How do we fix the process? How is the process currently working, and how did that contribute potentially to where we are?
Well, first let me say the state approves this. I mean, the state just says as long as your unfunded liability is being amortized over 30 years according to the state law, they're approving it. And so they have, my understanding is they've approved this change in methodology.
And what's the state's stake in this if this doesn't work?
The state rebates what we call 175, 185 taxes. They're approximately about $9 million a year now. They go back to the city, they go into the pension fund. And my understanding is about half of it is used to reduce the city's contribution, and the other half is being used for benefit improvement.
John, is that right?
Close.
Okay.
Okay.
Right, okay.
Close enough for an actuary.
Okay.
One last question. As we try to understand the flexibility then, to John's point about how this might be smooth, do we have the ability, so there's $1.7 billion of unfunded liability approximately. Do we have an ability to consider that balance that's aggregated over a 30-year period? Or is the 30-year already the layer approach that's built it up? This is as much flexibility as we have for payoff.
You could always go back to the layer. I'm pretty sure the state would approve taking apart the layer approach, but you could not go to 30 years from today, because that would say that some of your UAL that was created in the 90s and the 2000s
It's
would
going
be
longer.
paid off over more than 30 years. Where the 23 years came from is he looked at each piece of UAL, each payment, some are over, shorter period, and did a weighted average that is acceptable to the state. Is also a methodology that the IRS used to let private pension plans do. And it came up with the average, the weighted average was 23 years, and that's where it comes from.
So in terms of our flexibility, the amount that across all those columns is paid off by 2036.
Yes.
Is that hard-coded under existing law, or can that be modified to later periods?
You could not take the whole 1.7 billion and say, instead of paying it all off at one debt, rather than 23 years, we're going to go to 30 years. But you could go back to the original, where instead of one big debt of 1.7 billion, you have 15 or 20 sub-debts that add up to 1.7 billion. I believe the state would allow you to pull it apart, and therefore you would have some of those debts are going to be paid off in 1 year, some are going to be paid off in 4 years. The ones that were created in 2011 would be paid off in 29 years. The new ones from 2012 would be paid off in 30 years.
So that would change the pattern of the payments, but it would not extend the final date by when that liability has to be.
Well, the 2012 payment would be 30 years, so you would pay off a part of the debt would be stretched out to 30 years.
What do you think it would do to the expected cost to the city if you were to reconstruct it in the manner you recommend?
It would, you would not, all I can really say without looking at it is you would not have the peaks. It would be flatter probably, but it would also not be steady increasing. There would, I'm trying to think back to the 2011 evaluation done by the actuary, and I think it went up. It might trend down because at some point you lose a base. So I think it would be more flatter, I guess, with peaks and valleys, but never as high as it is there. And in 2036, so 30 years would take you out to 2042. So once you got beyond 2036, you would be at a higher point because you're still paying it off.
Sure. You know, one of the questions I have is, well, all the data we review, I've seen charts that show the funding of the Police and Fire Pension Fund over history and funding ratio. However, that funding ratio is measured by many different ways of the actuaries' analysis and measuring the funding. So you mentioned that UAL was accruing in the 90s, and the data I saw is the funding ratio was going up. And I might be splitting hairs there, but we've looked at a lot of data, and I just want to make sure we're looking at it the right way.
I think what I was trying to say were bases were being established in the 90s. I was trying not to refer to the funded status in the 90s. Okay. But the original 2011 VAL, which had the 15 or 20 bases, had bases from, I remember, from 82, 85, all through the 80s and 90s. And the bases are caused by benefit plan changes, by just experience gains and losses. Every time you do evaluation, as was alluded to earlier, the fund doesn't earn 7% of what's being assumed. People don't retire exactly what's being assumed, so you have what we call actuarial gains or losses. That can be plus or minuses that affect it. Whenever you change assumptions, whenever you change the methods, you create another amortization base. And that's why there's probably 15 or 20 of them.
Mayor Payton's administration put together a great report on how we got here with the deficit, and a big part of what they focused on was the granting of retroactive benefits. Have you seen pension plans that, through the governance structure, eliminate the ability to grant retroactive benefits ever again for participants so that we don't take on additional costs without funding going in at the same time?
I am not aware of any of that. Most of the plans I have seen, when they grant increased benefits, when they improve benefits, usually do it for past service also.
Just from my mind, because I had been toying with the notion that, well, you've got a $1.7 billion unfunded liability. You pay $90 million a year for 20 years, you've paid it off. But what you're saying is you can't do that because you've got different maximums. Because if you went out 20 years from now, part of that's going to be beyond the 30 years for some of that unfunded liability. Is that what I'm hearing as a tool? Or if we did something like that, would it be an allocation so that you'd allocate the earlier dollars to the earlier debt? Can we do that is my question.
Yeah, I mean, let me go back. You can, right now there's the $1.7 billion, which is being paid off over 23 years. That complies with state law. And if you continue on this pattern, that none of that $1.7 billion can be deferred to be paid off beyond 2036. Okay? Okay. But back on what the actuary had in his 2011 report, instead of just the one big debt, right, he had, I'm saying 15 or 20 sub-debts. Those are, if you go back to that, they're paid off over different periods of time. Right. So if you were to come, I guess you could allocate money.
That's my question. So if you said $90 million a year and you allocated it to the earlier years first, Jim, would that be legal? Could you?
Well, I think what Robert is describing in terms of going back to the individual bases, yes, that would be legal. I think that would the state would accept.
Yeah, what you would have to do. What you would have to do is when you went back to the individual basis, let's just say you're going to do a steady $90 million, and I'm not
Right.
saying that's the right number.
I'm not either, right.
I think you would have to demonstrate to the state that any 1 year, the 90 million is sufficient to make sure nothing is being deferred beyond 30 years.
Okay. Johnson?
Just to get back to John's question, we've seen in other places, not where retroactive benefits are somehow included, but where retroactive benefits, or any benefit really, must be accompanied by an actuarial study, such that the cost is listed before anything like that is enacted. That's something that's been adopted elsewhere.
Yeah.
Well, that's the law enforcement.
Yeah.
But the problem is that those actuarial impact statements are only required to show the first year change in the cost.
They don't show it out over the,
Required to show what it's going to cost out over the 30 years.
Yeah.
Additionally, the expected rate of return could be increased to offset the additional costs. The mortality tables could perhaps be different. The expected retirement dates could be different. So this analysis involves a lot of variables that can be changed to make something look the way you want it to look.
So going back to John's original point, if we could write into the governance structure that no retroactive benefits, for example, would be granted unless this type of actuarial study was done and the costs were analyzed, blah, blah, blah. Cindy?
Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to make clear, it is the city council who grants the benefits, not the police and fire pension
Right.
fund. So with the 30-year agreement it was still the council's decision under the charter and the ordinance code to wouldn't put in a PFPF charter about retroactive application and all that. That would be the recommendation of the city council to handle that, which is a much clearer, cleaner agreement.
Okay.
Granting of future benefits.
And to do that, since one council can't bind another, you could put it in the charter.
You could put it in the charter, which, again, the council can amend.
Well, that's true.
So you just leave it to the elected officials to make the decision at the time that's best.
Sure. Okay. All right.
And while we've got you, I don't mean to jump too fast, but to Mr. Delagall's response earlier about challenging a view or a finding, if the fund could no longer hire outside counsel and the city council decided that the general counsel was the only exclusive resource for the police and fire pension fund for legal matters, and the general counsel decided to agree with previous rulings, would that be an issue at all?
It would, because it could be challenged in court, because it's an interpretation, so they could still go to court, yes.
Any citizen?
Any citizen, the Attorney General, if it involves the state. Right.
The funds were denied to us in the two different
Right.
state challenge or city reject action on our part.
Right.
The conflict issue that came up though is the board would be unable, I believe, under their fiduciary obligations to challenge, to give up $10 million to preserve their own powers. So the issue was, they couldn't take a position that says, don't give us the $10 million because it messed with our benefits.
Yeah. They wouldn't be able to do that. Right.
I think
Okay.
the real problem would not maybe be a challenge, but if you get change in personnel over there and they change their opinion.
Well, I'll just say, I think it's correct whether FRS says or anybody else says, and there's an easy way to find that out with the definition.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Right. Okay.
That's just a brief question.
Yeah, sure. This is what we're supposed to be doing, right?
To the point about flexibility to the task force. For the years 2007 and later, a 30-year period would put you beyond 2036. Has that 30-year period already been comprehended? I'm looking at 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12's normal cost accruals? Or is it been truncated at 2036, or has it already been allowed as a layer in this analysis to go out to the full period allowed?
No. Okay. I believe the last valuations were done 2011 prior to 2012, and then 2008. Is that correct? Okay. So in 2008, when they had the separate layers, the UAL that was created, which could have been a charge or a credit, was amortized over 30 years. Okay. The 2011 val, again, did the same thing, amortized that, and so that was all rolled into the 2012 out. So if you take it apart, then the 11 would be 30 years from 11, the 8 would be 30 years from 8.
Okay, so for going forward, to help us going forward, it seems to me we need a model of what that would look like with that staggered.
Well, I think what we're hearing is we don't have enough, because we look at what's a good end game. An end game is to recognize inflation is going to solve some of the problem. An end game is to say we need something that maybe is a more level kind of a payment plan that could consider advance payments as a way to get there and smooth it to an affordable plan.
Right.
But as we look at doing that, we can't get those outcomes by extending the period of payoff. We can only get it by moving the periods of payments. And I think that's where the money is in terms of.
So what are we going to, assuming that we're going to want to do something like that, what do we need to help us in making that decision?
I think one piece that we're sort of missing a little bit is an understanding. I mean, there's doing what's got to be done because it's a good plan design, and there's doing what needs to be done because there's limits on affordability. And so I think a little bit of good information would be, what's a target range between X and Y that realistically we have to hit as a city to be able to afford this, right? And can we stay within those boundaries? If we can't, that's a whole different problem. But how do we stay within those boundaries and then moving this around to try to achieve a range of affordability and getting a little bit of feedback from the city as to what that ought to be, and if we want a higher range, what that means in terms of tax revenues, and how do you make the hard choices in getting to a band that we can afford.
So who would be the one, I'm not sure I understand.
I think the city would provide us direction regarding affordability. And Pew would provide us direction regarding maybe inflationary. I mean, there's a little bit of a tricky slope on inflation, right? I mean, I don't know that our tax base is increasing that fast as inflation is, but there's probably better judgments on that. We take a view on inflation, and then that gives us a range of a slower curve that we saw on the earlier slide. The city would tell us what's a sweet spot for what we can realistically consider between X and Y. And then Pew would help us fit the curve to that outcome.
Okay.
And additionally, this analysis doesn't impute a rate of return on the existing funds, right?
Well, this is based on the 7%, assuming that you earn 7%.
7 or 7.75?
What?
Is it 7 or 7.75?
7%.
All right, Bob? I just want to, I'm a little lost here. I just want to try to get for the committee what we need, because it's starting to get pretty far over my head. So what I want to do is to get y'all the information that y'all are going to need, assuming, I want to make sure I got the assumption right, that we are going to want to pay down this unfunded liability on some basis.
Would you want a subcommittee perhaps to
Well,
work on this?
let's come back to that, because I want to talk about how we go forward. So, Bob, and then...
I think it would be helpful to see a graphic presentation of the layers, and then maybe to have somebody take a look at some possible modelings of what those payments would look like, and at least it would give us something to react to.
The sub-mortgages, the layer that you talked about, in terms of the underlying interest rate assumptions about that are another variable, it seems to me, that ought to be at least considered.
Okay.
What went into this relative to, if there's sub-mortgages, is it the same, are we implying the same rate? And what's the basis for that kind of an assumption?
Okay. Chris?
Sure, Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to offer, the city is already doing some modeling using the alternative sort of data amortization that Mr. described. We would be happy to, at the next meeting, present some of those findings with any enhancements the task force would like us to build into that, and of course collaborate with.
Okay, I appreciate that. David, what?
I was just saying that, we'd be happy to redo this using those bases
Okay.
from the 2008 valve
Right.
and show that, kind of tranched approach, which
Okay.
I would agree with Robert, is a good way of handling ongoing, both prior and ongoing unfunded liabilities.
Okay.
So, well, as you're doing that, can you also show the difference in cost among different plan options going forward, and how this would affect, and the varying options with this would affect those varying plans?
Definitely.
You mean in terms of plan design?
Right. We didn't see the cost of the plan design.
Right.
We saw the wealth.
Okay. All right. So I had thought going forward, because of the sunshine law, it'd probably be easier for us to stay together as a whole, but I'm now getting the sense that this would be an appropriate place for a subcommittee because we got really one more meeting, January the 8th. So I think a subcommittee would be appropriate to meet between now and Christmas to get this done, so we've got it out ahead of time. Y'all agree?
I'd like to nominate David Bohr.
Yeah, I think David ought to be there. I think David and John and Bob might be.
Well, I was just going to say, I certainly don't think we can wait until the next meeting to see that data.
I agree with that. So, anybody else want to serve on that committee? Charlie, I thought I saw you raising your hand. All right, so so y'all will undertake that, and as I understand it, in my limited mind, that's really related to the spreading of the ongoing payment of the unfunded liability. That really doesn't have, it's related, but it doesn't have the same impact as if you put in, as the Civic Council said, $500 million or $100 million at the front end. That's a different issue. It's related, I understand that.
It's very related. Once this is determined, the other question I had, the questions were the risks of a one-time contribution, because we market time it wrong, we've really messed up. The risks of ongoing payments, and perhaps there's less risk with a smooth payment. But we need to model that and identify, what our probabilities are, because what's the probability at the top of the market, and what's the time for the one-time payment? How do we plan out to make the one-time payment at a more opportune time, and how do we be sure the resource sources are there from the city to do that? So it gets a little more complicated to do it right.
I knew it wasn't going to be easy. All right, and related to that then is what David suggested, which Chris responded to on the affordability and those parameters. So that would be something to be considered.
Bill,
Gwen.
as well, while you're going through this process, is it not also important that you start thinking of what, at the end of the day, we save, the net saving to the city of Jacksonville? The way in which, maybe we break up these pieces or follow this through. At the end of the time, do we have some kind of net savings? When you're talking about $1.7 billion, we ought to be looking at further down the line and saying, maybe this year we can pay a little bit more because something else happened and will save us at the end of the day. And I hope that as this discussion is taking place, that you also take that into consideration.
And further, how do we obligate future elected officials, future actuaries, future committee members and trustees to be sure that our plan is fulfilled and funded? If I may, I particularly like the idea of having some financial experts as a part of a volunteer committee that works with the board, knowing full well that, yes, the board has the final decision, but certainly if you have experts in the field who know the market, know how investments are run, it's going to be a lot easier for people on the board to make decisions that are going to have long-term ramifications.
Sure. Going to the matter of the Investment Advisory Committee.
Yes.
Right, okay.
Yes.
Charlie. So before we, I think you're going to something else.
Well, I'm staying on the unfunded liability.
Right, but so we're going to appoint a subcommittee. David's going to be the chair, John's going to be on it, and Bob's going to be on it, and anybody else that wants to be on it, if y'all want to. I don't want to impose that. And y'all will meet and have something back to us before December. Gosh, we're already in December. Before the 20th? 3 weeks? Okay, 3 weeks. Yes, Greg?
Mr. Chairman, would you just clarify for the subcommittee, what is it that you're asking them to provide an opinion on?
That's a good question. Would you like to? What I understand is they're going to take a look at the how we pay the unfunded liability using some parameters of what we can afford, what the city says is affordable, taking into account the expected growth in the real estate values, tax receipts, and at the same time how we would be limited in paying it off over this 30-year period within the limitations of the statute. That's what I understand.
Okay,
Is that helpful?
I think, just to the chairman of the subcommittee, I think it might be helpful to have a specific charter. And there was some discussion about whether we're going to do sort of the old version, mortgage style, I guess is what we would call it, versus the current presentation. Just from my standpoint, I think the liability is the liability. I mean, we're going to have to pay it. How we count for it that's part of it, but the real impact is just what you said, which is how much it's going to cost the city and how that factors into the budget of the city. So that, to me, is the emphasis.
How much does it cost? Okay. David and I worked this out.
And it sounds like the two primary objectives of the subcommittee are A, to review differing actuarial approaches to addressing the liability and sharing that with the entire committee, and B, the payment options for addressing those different actuarial approaches. And I think if we keep it as simple as that, and we're here to provide information, not an opinion, I think that could be more effective.
Okay, but though I would prefer to have some opinion coming out because of the time we have left. I think y'all use your best judgment and then make some sort of recommendation going forward, so we don't have to go back through the whole thing.
Well, is that to include the recommendation by David when he said that to pay down pension debt, you have to cut spending, raise revenue, modify the current employees and contribution? Will they be exploring and looking at those areas as well?
No, that's the pension design. I think that's something different.
Yeah, but since we have a small window here.
Yeah.
Waiting on that and then considering other options, to me, seems that it's going to extend our opportunity to evaluate everything in entirety and give a prudent recommendation.
Well, I don't want to turn the subcommittee as a subcommittee that takes over all of our work. So I think that's the danger in that. I think y'all have to be informed.
I think the way that, you're right, it is an all-circular argument. How does this all come together in the end, right? And
Right.
I think what we would have perhaps is, what's the range of flexibility that we as a committee have to put funds into the plan? And there's going to be some headroom for new benefits, right? And there's going to be some minimum amount, no matter how you cut it, you can change when you pay it. And quite frankly, because it's credit card debt, because it's high interest rate debt, it's better to pay it off early, but you can only do what you can do. So within the parameters of what we can do, what is our, we've got to do this at least. How much more room do we have, and then how much more room does tax increases have? And there's different trade-offs as to whether you go higher and higher.
So that, Chester, then when we come back, if we've worked on pension design, then that would inform that at the next meeting. You can say, well, this is what we end up wanting to do on the pension design. So how does that change it? And so that when we come back at our final meeting, that will have all been wrapped up together. Okay?
Point for clarification.
Yes.
Now, do I understand that the committee is going to be working on potential sources of how we're going to get the revenue to pay this? Is that, okay.
Just potential payment plans.
Okay.
Right. So, Charlie had his hand up first. Then
I
Chris.
think perhaps a different, and in my simple mind, a more simplistic approach. What you're talking about, I think, is very important, but you're talking about financial engineering. We have this liability that has to be paid off, and the way it's structured here was designed to minimize the upfront payments, which obviously causes what you see,
Right.
which is a significant increase in the future. So through financial engineering, if we restructure this to reduce the out period contributions, it's going to by definition increase the near-term contributions. I mean, it's like the Pillsbury Doughboy. If you push him here, he's going to poke out over there. So I mean, it's a lot of financial. It's important financial engineering, but I don't think it changes the direction of what we have to accomplish. In my mind, a somewhat more easy to understand approach for my simple mind is if you look back at what city council and the city had to deal with, and the MSP that the administration negotiated, they were trying to reduce the pension contribution obligation for this year basically back to the 120 million, which it was the year before. And we understand the problems of that because it didn't really deal with the out years. But in that context, had city council approved that construct, there were sufficient funds for the city to do what it needed to do at the $120 million contribution level. Now, the city council decided not to do that, which is fine, which increased it to $115 million, and because of that, they went through the millage increase in order to fund city services. That's my view of all that, which may not be shared by people around the table. My mind is, if at $120 million, the city could afford to fund a $120 million pension contribution, the city could afford to fund its other obligations. I see that sort of as a baseline. That obviously doesn't get us to where we have to be. And we know if we don't pay more than what this chart shows, we're going to have a bigger problem in the future. So to me, if we said, okay, let's agree that the city's going to make an annual contribution included in its annual budget, $120 million, and now what additional amount do we have to put in to make this chart here affordable? To use the numbers that's been bandied about here, for example, the 2 mil increase. If you said there's going to be a 2 mil increase going to be dedicated solely to reduction, and I'm not saying the 2 mil is the right number. If you dedicate 2 mils solely to fund additional contributions to the pension plan, but it can't be like the lottery. You can't then eliminate the 120 because then you're going backwards. So if you agree that it's 120, it's going to be in the budget, and you're going to put, I'm going to say 2 mils, so it's $90 million more a year. So now the 120 becomes 210. Now, I don't know actuarially, if all of a sudden you start making $210 million payments each year, that's going to make a significant impact upon that ramp that goes up in the future. And I know the city has done, because I've seen the calculation, the city has done projections of what their property tax revenues will be. And between 2013 and 2018, they projected increase by 4.2%, about $18 million a year. You're not going to be able to fund it with that kind of increase in property tax revenue. So to me, again, those calculations and those decisions are extremely important. But I see it, we got to put in more than 150. We can't afford to put in 250. So how do we get there? Right. So to me, is you lock it in at 120, which I think based on the city council deliberation was an affordable number for the city budget. So the extra amount has to be additional funds that come from somewhere else, which is a logical place to me is the millage rate. Right. Dedicated solely to that. So when we decrease that liability, and I know the city council can always change their mind, but you decrease the liability, then the 2 mil increase goes away. It's dedicated for that purpose. And as long as, and to me, our public safety employees, they got to say, okay, what are we doing? As long as we guarantee those types of things to put their fund in good financial shape, that to me gives us the ability to sit down logically with them and negotiate the benefit side, which is the other piece, which is also critically important. So that's sort of my more simplistic approach.
And essentially, I think if you consider the options we're going to uncover as a subcommittee, you really have 3 primary alternatives to paying this down. This way, the opposite of paying it up front, and then smoothing it out. And based on market timing and dealing with investment markets, the smoother approach is probably going to be the best option. So did I just save us a lot of time, perhaps?
Yeah, the two of you did.
All right, so the chair thinks that we're not going to have a subcommittee now, is that right?
Well, I think the value of the inquiry, and Charlie has helped us sort of jump ahead and make some realistic decisions, is we're accepting 120 as the answer to the question. We're not going to debate how much more the city could pay and make an inquiry study. We've got a pretty good feel for that.
Right.
Secondly, we know what 2 mils is. It's $90 million. So you have filled in a lot of the gaps that would have been uncovered through the inquiry, and you've just taken us there. So if we're comfortable with that, I think that's a great approach.
But before we do that, Greg is the chairman of the Finance Committee. I'm not sure that the 120 is the right number, because it might be, because they cut a lot of services too. So if we left it at 120 and then had this increase, whatever it is, to fund it over a smooth time, you still have the city council having to deal with, well, what do we do about the libraries, the parks, the other things? So Greg, how about giving us some insights on the 120?
Well, I don't know that I can be
maybe
helpful
Chris
on that.
is somebody, or Joey also.
I think really the city can be, because they were the ones who constructed the budget. But it is true that the original, there were two budgets. The original budget included $120 million. With the first year savings from the proposed plan of $48 million. Isn't that right, Charlie? Yeah. And even in that budget, there were substantial cutbacks to the city services. I mean, that's, I think probably Chris and the budget officers can answer that question.
Well, what you said, Bill, was important because in this 120 budget, there was a very limited capital expenditure for infrastructure and all that the city needs. So it was not even a minimum budget. It required lots of cuts that were visible and invisible to the future.
That's right, and so that either the city council, we'd have to also expect, and the mayor, to increase that 120 may be all right for our purposes, but not for the city. Charlie?
And I agree with all the comments, but I think the difference was that the then city council approved an increase in the millage rate. So I mean, that increase is there. So I'm not sure you can go back and say, yeah, there were proposed cuts at the 120, but then there was an additional increase that allowed that to be, and that millage rate, and that's not going back. We know that.
Right. But that didn't cut, that increase in the millage rate still didn't bring the budget to a point that there weren't severe cuts in city services anyway.
But that budget had to contemplate a $150 million pension contribution. And I'm suggesting you roll that back to 120, which gives you additional $30 million. Because the eventually approved budget had a $150 million pension contribution with the increased $2 million increase in it. So if you set it back to the 120, that gives that additional $30 million, for the city council and their judgment to.
So if I might propose an analysis, I think what we're talking about is what would it look like if you smoothed it out over the 23 years and had equal contributions, and then what would that look like with each of the different new plan options and new ways of assigning benefits? How would each of those look on that type of a graph? Is that what we're talking about?
It sounds to me like it is now.
It is, I think, also just with allowing some curve because of inflation, to the extent we want to bank on the fact that tax revenues and inflationary will go up and help provide some of that.
Chris, let me.
I just wanted to put a question about the budget. I would just say that the modeling we are doing that we'll be happy to bring to the subcommittee when they meet contemplates many of these issues. One thing I would discourage the task force from doing, and certainly understand Mr. Appleby's point, is being too fixed on a particular number at this point. There are a lot of factors that go into it. The amortization methods that you use are very important. For example, the mediation settlement agreement, the city's pension payment this year would have actually been closer to $100 million, in part because of the
$20 million contribution.
Right. So again, what I would just recommend is let's take a look at some of these different methods. That's exactly the kind of modeling that we're going to bring to the subcommittee when it meets, as opposed to being fixed on any particular number.
All right. So let me understand what the subcommittee is now going to be doing. They are going to be ultimately they're going to be trying to establish what a recommendation for a base contribution would be, which would be equate to the 120 that we're talking about. Now that may not be the number, but that number, when y'all going to consider that in light of the various modeling that y'all have been doing, that would then change depending on the pension design, but that at least gets us to I guess we would use the current design at the moment, is that right? As our starting point?
That would be one of the graphs.
One of the graphs, okay.
In comparison
All right.
to the others. But before we move too fast, I do want to make sure that the experts are in agreement that this is a good path to go down and get their opinions as well.
So one, to the extent that what we're hearing is, which we think is a good thing, is that it's prudent to go beyond the minimum that Florida requires. To some degree, thinking about the right amortization path under the amortization methods is a little, somewhat moot. If we're going to go beyond that, it doesn't really matter what we're setting as that minimum. That being said, just broadly in terms of thinking about how you handle unfunded liabilities, there'll be unfunded liabilities in the future, kind of this tranched, each year gets amortized over its own specific base, is a thoughtful way of dealing with kind of some of the flaws of the alternative ways of doing it. So I think we wouldn't endorse it if we thought it was only a financial engineering thing. We think it's actually a proven approach. It happens to have, some financial impacts on that minimum required payment, but, I think the reason we think it's a proven thing is simply that it's a good way of handling things writ large.
Robert?
I would agree with that.
Okay. Do you understand, Mr. Chair, what you're going to be doing over the next 3 weeks? Okay.
Yeah, I think we proposed the charter for clarification. I think your points were good ones, John. I think the one thing that we'll need is the committee needing to get into the 120 or can we accept the 120? And I think Charlie's proposal is, but we can debate this 120 up and down. We got to make a decision.
Y'all want to accept the 120 now, but with the cautionary tone from Chris is if in their modeling it turns out that number's not right, but for their purposes, let's accept the 120. Is that?
Well, I'm not sure about the 120. My take is the cost is the cost is the cost once we determine what it looks like at a more level approach.
That's what would come after you meet with Chris and all that. All those come out, but for our purposes today, to get you started, the 120. Does that make sense? May not make sense.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Can I suggest another method that you might consider? If you looked at cities like cities and you determined of their budget, what percentage of their budget is being contributed to the pension, that might give you some of that scaling that you were talking about.
Aren't we well above those already?
We are, but it lets us know where we are.
David, you would have some of that information, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
And Robert probably does too.
Let me just.
Clarify one thing. We go back to the layer and why we endorse it is both the state uses it for their retirement system and a majority of the local cities use the layer.
The layered approach. Okay.
Well, and in relationship to the percentage that's going towards pensions, Mr. Anderson, the element that affects those percentages is also what are those cities spending on other services like libraries, et cetera. And so we would need a full mock-up to see where we stack up with otother cities. And I believe JCCI did an analysis, and it said in the 2009 study of our city finances that we don't spend enough on children, we don't spend enough in a number of other resources. And to me, that would be another very important study, but maybe not by this committee.
Okay.
Ted, one thing I was just going to add, and I'm not sure if it's germane to this discussion.
Here we are.
But one thing that I think that doesn't need to get lost is how do we address reserve accounts or excess accounts? In the recent negotiated settlement, there was a proposal to use some of the pension monies to fund the city obligations. And frankly, that's part of why we're here. I mean, we have about $200 million in excess funds that were used to fund the city's obligation over time. That came from the pensions coffers. So those funds, we need to make some decisions as to how those funds are utilized or recommendations. If we're saying that the city needs to not reduce its obligations to the pensions, but perhaps put that towards the unfunded liability, I think that would be a more sound approach. But I think it is something that we as a committee need to address because you're
talking about that stabilization reserve account?
Yes. Essentially, when the pension in good years had made more than was necessary to fund the city's obligations, the city used some of that money to pay.
As I understand it, that was only when, and I think I forget who told me this, was that it was when we had no actuarial need to fund anything.
Right.
So it really, right.
Yes, it was no actuarial need, I understand that.
Right.
But still, it was additional money.
That could have accumulated, as John Keane says.
And
right.
we would be in a lot better position if that money was just allowed to stay.
Right. So that's
And so I think what you might be getting at is do we have a standard for funding the plan even when we have excess reserves due to good markets so that we have a minimum standard of funding, which probably won't come into play for 50 years, but
We don't know.
nonetheless, it'd be important to obligate our officials to do that.
And so that's in a governance section. So,
Or if we just decide, here's the minimum level of payment for this year, you know, we can't fudge on that minimum level of payment by saying, hey, they had a good year and let's just reduce the payment.
right, that's right.
We should be using that money to pay down the unfunded liability rather than,
Right.
rather than to just ignore the obligation.
Okay. I think we're clear, and David and I'll work out the charter for this, but are y'all happy with where we are at the moment?
I'm not quite clear, and nor am I satisfied with the 2 mills that I keep hearing as a method of raising revenue. I keep hearing that number, and I keep hearing raising, without exploring other opportunities.
We're going to get to that right now.
exist.
We're going to get to that right now. There are 2 other parts in the modeling. What are your views about making an upfront payment now from other sources? And I don't know whether this impacts on y'all or not, but we need to discuss it. We've had the notion of pension obligation bonds. Is it too early to decide whether we even want to consider that or not? To my mind, if we make any additional payments, we have to have some governance changes. And we'll get to that in a minute, I guess. But what's your view on using other assets to fund the upfront payment? Charlie?
I am against the pension obligation bonds. I think the presentation we got on that clearly showed that there's a razor-thin arbitrage based upon the more current information that we have. And it just doesn't seem like it's a good bet that the city should make. That's my own personal opinion.
I'd agree. I think that-
I agree too.
All right, so we can...
It's all about market.
So we can take pension obligation bonds off the table?
Yes.
All right, that's off the table. How about how about first contributing city real estate to the pension fund and letting them either manage it or dispose of it?
No.
No.
Have we heard any?
Cindy was coming up to tell us not to do that.
Well, if we were, the information we would need as investors would be how has the police and fire pension fund managed such real estate?
Right.
So to give us an expectation going forward and analyzing whether or not that's the most effective way to fund the plan and the alternative being selling the real estate.
Well, I'm getting to that in a minute. So the alternative, I'm hearing a resounding, we don't want to give city real estate, but we might, and the city is doing this study, we might want to have RFPs for various city real estate, sell it on the open market,
Right.
and use that cash. We're not taking that off the table, but that's a difference. And so am I hearing that we still want to keep the notion of using other assets? Okay?
In addition to that, too, we probably need to have some kind of idea about what kind of revenue that would bring in,
Sure.
whether it's advantageous at this time because of what's happening in the market
Sure.
right now to sell it.
To sell it.
We need to know
That's
that.
right. And we don't, and y'all are still conducting that study. In fact, I don't even know that you've got a consultant yet because that went out for bid and came back.
Just an update on that, we're doing that in-house actually through our Public Works Department and our Office of Public-Private Partnerships. So some of the modeling that we bring will contemplate some of those possibilities.
Right.
Of what might, sort of from an initial estimate, might be available.
So that from the committees, our committee, since we're going to be finished probably before that's completed, is that we would take a position that the sale of excess city real estate is a viable proposition if it's market-driven, if it's under a protected process, so that the proceeds could then be used for, we won't be able to decide, but all that, those sort of issues we can talk about. Okay? Kirsten.
I wanted just to move back for 1 second, and when we're talking about this one-time contribution, I'd like to get a little bit more framing from from you, if you're willing. I know in your presentation you did some comparison about what it would look like with a one-time contribution of, say, 100 million versus, this 90 plus. And it looks like even with 100 million, those annual payments are still well above kind of what we're just generally accepting as a threshold of a 120 payment. I'm just wondering, based on what little we've heard about the feasibility of the city being able to pay anything above 120 for a substantial period of time, if the one upfront payment is even really a feasible suggestion.
Well, and if you wanted to get into that 120, it certainly needs to be bigger than that 100 million. I guess there's two ways to think about it. So one, if the city is already going to sell real estate, if it turns out to be, a prudent and good idea, putting the money into the PFPF that's a debt that, anything you can do to mitigate is good. If you want to handle it all by one-time payment, whether it's by bond or by some other one-time thing, yeah, it would need to be a very big figure to get down to that level. I guess the final piece is that, just every dollar you put in now is going to be worth more than the dollar you put in 5 years or 10 years from now.
Right.
So that's one of the advantages of trying to front load, which once again, I think we're very encouraging that the task force has expressed a lot of interest in trying to have a smoother, less backloaded approach.
Okay.
Effectively, however, the issue with the pension obligation bonds was timing. Does the one-time contribution not be affected by the same issue?
Yeah, if you're going to have if it's 100 million, relative to scale, maybe you just put it in. If it's $1 billion, there's an argument to put it over several years so you have less timing risk.
You're exposed to credit risk, though. Right. There's not side risk as well. Right.
Okay. Are we through with this subject? I think.
Just one more thing on the revenue side, Bill.
Mm-hmm.
So we've dispensed with bonds, we've dispensed with giving city real estate to the pension fund. If Pew has time, there was a piece again about Atlanta about 2 weeks ago in the press and how they're funding their unfunded liability. I would love to see an analysis of that because it was pretty creative in terms of some revenue sources. So I think we would benefit from that.
Right. Now, as I remember I was in Atlanta and they had a Sunday analysis in the paper that the Atlanta did not do much of anything for the unfunded liability. They put in $25 million a year extra. So they still had a huge unfunded liability.
Well, I tell you, I get, as a taxpayer, get really frustrated about the bed tax conversation locally. He used bed tax. I know that there's some legislative challenges for us, but I think we got to be a little smarter about what the additional revenue sources could be, because we cannot continue to defund everything that we're defunding in this city.
Right. So, Chris, perhaps you could circulate, or some, maybe Ronnie, maybe the council auditor, I don't know who, what are the revenue sources that we might tie into, as Sherry suggests, and taking into account what other communities have done, like Atlanta. Could you get that to us in the next week to 10 days? Great.
Some of that may be included in the modeling we present to the subcommittee.
Great.
That may be
A way to do that. Okay, that's a good idea.
For example, I think that there was a recommendation that some of it be derived from JEA. What would that then be taken from?
Right.
If it's coming from JEA. And Mr. Drain, the $100 million one-time contribution, did Pew have any ideas about where we would get that $100 million?
That was just, we wanted to give a sense of scale. If you did it, did 100 million, long-term savings projected to be about 67, net of that 100. So put in 100, save 167, future contributions, that's about the scale of the net increase. We just wanted to be able to show that.
With the many policy experts at the Pew Charitable Trusts, are there any studies as to where municipalities might find that type of money, in what way? Because we do want to make sure that if we have a recommendation in that avenue, from that approach, that it's consistent perhaps with best practices. And there's a lot of arms at Pew. I didn't know if that might be something you could find.
I think we can talk about some worst practices to avoid. The two options that have been really put on the table are either bonding or selling existing assets. And, bonding seems to be currently off the table, so are there assets that is worth selling, either because you're going to sell them anyhow, and this is, the right opportunity to do so, or because this is a good way of handling, what's a sizable debt. Either or, those are the two basic questions. You could also do, a one-time levy of some sort, but, the obvious ones are either bonding or asset sales.
And also the other revenue sources, like the JA, I'd forgotten about, that is a source that the council president actually brought up. So, but if you don't, but that's still money in the bottom line of the budget. So you've really got the same problem. If you take $90 million from the JA's fees that they pay, and you don't ask them for more, you've still got that same budget hole. So but those revenue sources are there. John?
Realizing we don't have the full answer to the real estate question, in an order of magnitude in terms of city-owned real estate, what are we talking about in terms of amount?
What's
any sense
ballpark,
of that, Chris?
I'm sorry I keep making you walk up and back.
I'm reluctant to sort of share an amount because we're still doing that analysis. When we come back with the modeling, we'll be able to provide some initial estimates. In fact, Mr. Grady and I had a long meeting with that team yesterday to get some of that data. So when we come back to the modeling, we'll be able to provide better answers.
Okay.
Would you also be able to provide any offers the city has received? Because it's one thing to say, this is what I think my house is worth. It's another thing to actually negotiate the process. And it's a third item to consider, what if we developed it and were able to charge rent or leases on the property and created a revenue generating source for the, in perpetuity, as opposed to just selling an asset at what are probably low values?
Well, I'd say there's sort of two considerations. One, what's the value you could sell the property for? And the way the asset optimization study is taking place, Mr. Thompson, is they're looking at the values the property appraiser has on the property. Now, obviously, those are not necessarily exactly what they will be on the open market, but that's sort of the best valuation they have at the moment. The other thing I would say to consider is not just the value of what you can sell that property for, but also what's the value of the annual ad valorem revenue that will come from taking those properties from public ownership and putting it into private ownership. Those are two of the revenue factors we're looking at in this analysis.
Are you going to price all the art you've got to?
Well, quite frankly, we were kind of hoping to tap into the Wells Fargo financial advisor.
Keeping in mind that if you just develop it and have an income stream, you're not making much of a dent on the unfunded liability. You are making a dent on the millage year to year, but you're really not doing much. Okay.
Bill?
Yes.
Before you mentioned JEA, and I would caution everybody to think real hard about going to JEA for that, because if I remember correctly, taking $90 million out of the allocation that the JEA gives us puts this city in a really, really difficult situation, right, especially neighborhoods and city services. I'm sure Councilman Anderson has dealt with that and looked at that. Taking that out to put on the pension puts a very, very big hole, or did a few years ago, puts a very, very big hole in what the city has available to take care of just basic city services. Right. And we've seen in the last few years of what that's doing to neighborhoods and what's it doing to us as a city. So
sure.
I would be very, very concerned that if we talk about taking that out of the general fund.
That's the exact point, because you're taking that money, you're either going to take it out of the budget, you're either going to raise the millage rate to do it, or you might, what Council President Gulliford suggested was it would be easier to bind future councils if you used the source of the cash coming from the JA rather than committing them to a 2 mil tax increase along the way. That's a structural issue. So it's the same dollars. But Bob?
Yeah, I think Charlie addressed that. Unless you generate new revenue, it doesn't really make any difference. It's a zero-sum game.
That's exactly right.
David, can I ask you, you said it was a $67 million return on your $100 million. What is the net present value of that return?
I mean, I guess ultimately depends on what you discounted that.
Right.
If you discounted at 7, it should be 0.
Right,
you
okay.
At, but inflation adjusted, that was 57.
Right, I just wanted to make the point that, $67 million, a 60% return on your money looks like a good return, but if you net present value that back at whatever, that has a tendency to disappear.
The chair wants to move on now. If we put this part of it to bed, subject to our, we still need to talk about pension design, governance, and investment options. Pension design, did we get, we've got the, we really haven't talked a lot about that. What's your feeling on pension design? Where do we go with that?
Can I
Ted?
make some statements? Yeah, this is my, the reason I really got involved in this, and I had a long discussion with the sheriff too. I know he made a presentation to the group earlier, but he's very concerned about the issue of employee turnover and the cost. And I think that's important in a law enforcement setting, for law enforcement employees. And I've tried to sort of, and I've got some additional concerns too about that, but I think that what we've seen is, I represented law enforcement officers for many years in disciplinary matters, defending them in lawsuits along with the city of Jacksonville. And there is a certain, beyond the cost of turnover and training, which is considerable, it's about $85,000 to maybe over $100,000 per employee when you lose an employee to turnover. Beyond that, there's a lot of additional cost. There is no question that your younger officers cause the majority of your disciplinary issues. The younger officers cause the most of the civil liability issues for the city. And there's just a great number of reasons why the pension system is set up and has traditionally been set up to maintain employees for a long period of time.
With the caveat to that being the DROP program, which was increasing the incentive to retire earlier.
Well, it was. And I think that we need to look at that, and I think some of the proposals for the backdrop actually make sense because they reverse that incentive. But I think the cost, just the immediate financial cost in terms of the turnover, the more hidden cost in terms of discipline, also, I think one of the important things, the way that these pensions are designed, they are designed to basically pay somebody the way you pay a contractor. You're paying them at the end of the job to make sure that the job is well done. And there is built into the pension system a forfeiture provision if an employee does commit a crime or is terminated for reasons that involve taking of city money or city property or theft. They can forfeit the entire pension. And the reason they do that is we give law enforcement officers especially, but also firefighters, give them a great deal of responsibility. We give them guns, we let them come in our house, we trust these people to be the folks who we depend upon. I can tell you that having represented folks in various different law enforcement agencies, the much better law enforcement agencies are ones in which you've got more senior officers. And you've got those people who are developing an institutional memory. Sheriff Rutherford was telling me about the number of officers he has had leave in the last 2 years since all the pension stuff.
He told us that too.
And
yeah.
I think it was extraordinary. I mean, he was saying that in the last 2 years, it's probably equal to the number who have left, before retirement age in the rest of his career, which is over 30 years. So I think looking at those things, we've got to really ask ourselves, what role does this pension system have? I mean, private sector got rid of defined benefit plans mainly because they were not maintaining employees for long periods of time. So there's greater employee turnover in the private sector by design, and that's somewhat what they need. But the public sector, especially police and fire, I think there's an absolute need to maintain that benefit. The one other thing that I would add to it, besides the cost of turnover and the need to maintain employees, is the other costs that we haven't really looked at of immediate cost of vesting. And I don't think it's been well explained to this board, but when an employee reaches 6 years under the current plan, he or she is entitled to pension benefits. Those pension benefits become payable at the 20th anniversary.
Right.
I think that would have an extraordinary effect if we were to say to employees, even somebody who's at the 10-year mark, you can leave now and in 10 years you start getting your pension, but you can go somewhere else. You don't have to stay here because your future benefits are not going to continue to accumulate in a defined benefit program. One of the things that I did, and I passed around this chart of what has happened to police officer salaries over the last 20 years. And I think that was instructive because that chart showed you a lot of the, showed you that the salaries had increased very gradually, if at all, and had increased less than inflation over the last 20 years. I think it shows two things. It shows, first of all, that during the 90s, when there were all kinds of construction jobs out there and things that people could have left being a police officer and gone and done this work, they didn't leave because they had a guarantee of a pension at the end of 20 or 25 or 30 years. If we had some people leave at that point, we would have had to replace them to pay for turnover costs. Secondly, we were able to get them to stay on at lower salaries than we would have otherwise been able to encourage them to stay on if it had not been for a defined benefit plan.
I thank you for sharing the income inflation rate
Yeah.
for the workforce. When I looked at that, it made me think the median income in the last 25 years is negative over 15% against inflation today.
Right.
So they've done better than the middle person in our country. But we would need to see how they've done comparable to other law enforcement agencies.
Right.
And comparable to perhaps other metrics than that. But that is a phenomenon that certainly, wage growth has been a major issue in the private sector as well.
Sure. But in terms of, certainly there was a number of very good years where wage growth, wages did increase considerably, where police officers did stay, I would imagine. Maybe I'm wrong.
David, are you able to take some metrics with what the city could give you in terms of information and compare it with other agencies within the state of Florida? With other, what the information is, right?
I mean, it's going to depend on what we can get from other cities.
Right.
Didn't the Civic Council do that in their initial report? When they came down with the recommendation that we stay with some variation of a defined benefit, it was because that's what most of the other cities are doing. And to be competitive, we need to be there.
Well, and they acknowledged they did not do a full analysis. It was anecdotal. So we really didn't see a full analysis on what other cities are doing. It was sort of a gut sense they had, I think, as I recall.
And Bobby, would the sheriff have the comparisons with other communities, do you think?
I think that there are some salary comparisons
Yeah.
with other cities, but I think, just to be fair, I think that if you look at, since you've got two different departments, fire and police, I think that if you chose like 5 cities that are comparable size-wise to Jacksonville and looked at them, and you looked at both sides, you could look at salaries on both sides of the aisle, police and fire, and I think you could get a good sense on what.
Plus their pension, what their pensions are, okay.
And while we're looking at that, if the salaries are different, would we also look at the number of safety employees in relationship to the number of citizens? Because if they have a lower number and perhaps a bigger budget, they can afford to pay more, which companies often choose to do. And so we'd have to look at all the analytics on that.
Well, I mean, I can tell you this, that in the last budget, I know Councilman Anderson was at the table and came to the wall over there at the sheriff's office during this budget process, but.
They don't know what the wall is, you might want to tell them.
That was where the sheriff took all of the councilmen and almost every one of them.
We went through his budget line by line.
Reviewed his budget and went over it prior to going to the budget for the approval process. However, what it showed was Jacksonville ranks very low, and we're at the bottom on the number of officers per 1,000 citizens. So we are really way low compared to every other place in the state of Florida. And there's many other cities have many more officers per 1,000. So to get to where in the middle,
our increase of the budget was not even something that the city could consider. So, I mean, that being said, I know that there are numbers, Mr. Thompson, that, you know, we can get for that. So,
If you could get that for us, that'd be great.
The question is whether or not that's the market in terms of looking at other cities. Is that where we lose, when folks leave the force, whether that be police or fire, where do they go? And if they're not going to other cities, then that's kind of irrelevant to what we're dealing with. So what are the other?
Mr. Chairman, just to give you an example, we had lay off 48 officers 2 years ago. We laid off 48. We couldn't get half of them to come back because they were concerned about the budgetary issues. But they went to Orlando. They were immediately scooped up Orlando, Tampa, and other departments because they got a fully trained officer. It didn't cost them anything for training. And they put them immediately out on the street with just a small transition.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Okay. Chester, then Bob. No, Chester?
I think the negotiated settlement with the union was not that bad in terms of pension design. You know, a lot of the elements that they negotiated, in my opinion, were elements that were recommended that we should look towards in terms of increasing, you know, the years become invested and all that.
Right.
So I don't think it was a bad thing. It wasn't a bad.
And that's what the Civic Council concluded, too.
Right, but the problem that the Civic Council had, and remember, was that it didn't go far enough in terms of reducing unfunded liability. I think that was a big issue.
That's right.
And if the unfunded liability was addressed in I guess, a more responsible way,
right,
then it wouldn't have been so opposed to.
That, and they wanted more, they wanted to do something on existing employees, and they thought that should be a higher contribution. Right.
So I think a start would maybe go to look at what was negotiated and see if there are things that we need to look at in terms of seeing if we can get closer to what is acceptable.
Sure.
In terms of the design.
That's a good idea. Carl?
I agree with Chester. I was getting ready to make that exact point. If you'll turn to the mediated settlement agreement in the charts.
What page, what?
Page 17.
Of which one? Is this David's or Mike? That's David's. Page 17.
I believe it's on the screen there, too.
Okay.
It outlines, all of these different plans outline different aspects of what to do, but at least as a minimum, we know that the mayor's office and the pension board and the union that they agreed on these points. And they do, it seems to be a compromise between all of the others. So I would suggest that we at least start with this.
All right. Y'all in agreement with that? Yeah. Okay. Is that a yes, Charlie?
No, I will make that a comment.
Okay, hold on a minute then.
Well, that presumed that we were staying with a defined benefit.
That's my question. So one thing that I learned in doing the research on the governance is that we do have some flexibility. We can consider, in my opinion, we could consider the hybrid or the defined contribution. Do y'all want to put any of those off the table? Do we want to stay with the defined benefit?
With the defined contribution, we have to pay in, there was a upfront payment that we had to make into that was cost prohibitive if we switched.
Not for new employees.
Not for new, if only for new employees. Right.
Can I answer his question?
Yes.
I think one of the problems if you go to a pure defined contribution is you can't, when you pay off your unfunded liability, the state will not allow you to use a payment stream that increases to 3.25% a year. And you have to start at a much higher level.
For new employees?
No, the whole, okay.
Right.
When you're amortizing the unfunded liability, that chart that was up
Right.
earlier is assuming the payments are going up 3.25% a year.
Right.
And payroll's going up 3.25%.
Right.
So they're being held constant as a percentage. Once you put all the new people into the defined contribution plan, your payroll's not going up 3.25%.
Sure.
You can't consider it, so you're forced to do level dollar payments. So instead of the amortization payments looking like this, you're starting up here and, much higher point, you're, 170, 200 million.
With that increase too if you had more vested employees leave sooner? The upfront payments?
Probably not. The vesting in general in defined benefit plans, the vesting is not a big cost item because right now the current police officers are putting in 7% of pay. And so when they leave, if I'm correct, they get their money, if they want, they can get their money back, or their 7% is paid a lot of their benefits. A defined benefit plan for any one person, the actual cost goes up very steeply. So they're leaving early in their career when their cost is not that much.
No, but I'm saying, like, for instance, if you had somebody who left at 15 years and their benefit became payable at 20 years, do you have to account for the cost of that benefit currently when that person leaves?
Yes, that's built into the current system right now.
Right. So would you have, if you had more people leave who are vested but who have not reached full retirement, or more people leave at 20 years if you went to a different system, would you increase the cost?
In general, somebody leaving at 15 years is cheaper from the system, from a police system point of view, than if that person stays for 20 years and retires.
But if he did leave at 20 years, and if there's somebody who would have otherwise left at 25 or 30, that person leaving at 20 years would be much more.
Then he's eligible for full retirement. Yeah.
Okay.
So just one point on that amortization rule, it would also apply if new employees were put into FRS and the existing plan is closed to new workers. So it's about, if there is a plan closure, then, in Florida, that those contribution rules would trigger.
But even for new employees only?
Yeah, if you put the whole shebang in
Right.
FRS, not that.
Right.
You've seen evidence that FRS would accept.
But if for new employees, you either wanted to change the type of plan or move them to FRS?
Well, the rule the state has adopted is they look at the total payroll. And so if you don't have the new employees coming into that plan, that payroll is going to be shrinking because you got the people
Sure.
leaving, whether retirement or termination.
Right.
More than offsets any increase in salaries or pay raises. And so the payroll base is going down, and the Florida rules say you can only use this increasing amortization schedule if you can demonstrate that the payroll's been going up that fast.
Okay. Charlie?
Would you pull up slide 29?
Before you go on, I'd like to recognize Mayor Brown has come in the door. I didn't see you come in. We're glad you're here, Mayor. Thank you. Would you, I'm not going to ask you to say anything at this point. Okay, Charlie.
Can you pull up slide 29? 29 to me, when I looked at that, it had a lot of important points in it, to me at least, if I understand the slide. And I'm certainly sensitive to both the recruitment and the retention issue. And if you look at the current plan and you look at FRS, and I may be wrong in this, to my knowledge, in all other municipalities except for Duval County and Dade County, all the other police officers are in FRS.
No.
Aren't the great majority of them?
Not in most of the cities. Orlando, Tampa, most of the places
But
have
one
their
of
own.
the concerns is, and it was mentioned before, that the experienced, we hate to lose experienced officers more than anything. If you look at that chart, I'm trying to line it up, at age 45, between beginning and age 45, there's a pretty steep increase in the present value of their benefits. And then it starts leveling off, and then it drops off tremendously at the older ages. To me, the current plan with drop encourages people to leave when we most want to keep them, because they see their benefits trailing off. It's not good. It's not increasing as much as it was before. So to me, it encourages them to leave. Now, in the MSP, if you look at that chart, it's much lower than the other plans. It has a steep increase, but then it trails off towards the end, so it's actually less than the current plan. If you look at the Civic Council plan, it levels off and stays substantially below all the rest of the plan. if we want to encourage our public safety employees to stay long-term, to me, you want the plan that continually encourages them to stay long-term. And interestingly, the hybrid plan, at the end of the day, gives the best benefits to public safety employees in the long run. It keeps them in this steady growth, so there's not an incentive for them to leave. And the part that I like about, particularly on the page that talks about the hybrid plan, is it guarantees them a 4% return. And I'll probably have these numbers wrong. I know John's got all kinds of numbers flipped around here, but the 4% return is not significantly different from what's been realized by the plan over at least some period of time. But it also allows them to participate in the 75% of any increases over the 4%. So to me, it provides the best benefit long-term to the public safety employee. It does not encourage them to leave earlier. It minimizes the risk to the city because we're guaranteeing a 4% return, which is a whole lot easier bogey to meet than a 7 or 7.5 or 7.75% return. But it gives them the ability to participate in that increase, if I understand the plan properly.
Are we sure that includes a 4% return, or is that at the same 7% as the?
Yeah, so the plan would still be targeting the 7%. If it falls short, some of that cost is borne by employer, some of that cost is borne by employee. So we're still targeting that same 7%.
We need to see 4, 5, 6, just to see the variations. And does the current plan graph represent the drop plan included?
Yeah. Also, I think I forgot to say this, all these plans include the current health benefits as part of what's been projected. So, from what we have not heard any requests from analyzing reducing that, so we've kept them.
Yeah, we're not going to do the health benefits. Well, suppose we had modeled the hybrid, the mediated settlements proposal. Are those the two models y'all want to go forward on? Kirsten was before Bob. Kirsten?
I'd like to see the cost, the graphing of the cost to the city on all of these plans, and also how all of these plans projecting out 30 years or whatever, how they're going to impact and grow the unfunded liability. I think if we're going to really look at how we're going to choose them, we need to know which of them have a greater and lesser impact on the city's costs going forward.
Is that?
So to be clear, our objective in designing these was to have them be the same cost. So
they're equal.
Yeah, that was, what we heard from the various proposals, we got a sense that at least there's some interest in targeting 10% employer costs. A lot of the proposals that were brought up with the mayors and civic council targeted that. If you look at what FRS offers for new workers, it's about that as well. And so we just try to maintain that for all the alternatives.
So a hybrid plan has the same cost to the city as the mediated settlement.
The difference is really how they handle risk. That's, in the mediated settlement agreement plan or any of the traditional DBs that have been proposed so far, if there's investment losses, if there's something else that doesn't match predictions, employer costs go up. Under the hybrid plan, if it doesn't match predictions, those costs are shared between the employee and employer.
Right.
Similarly, if things outperform expectations, the employee gets some of that gain.
I want to remind us that, and what I want to ask you to do is to make sure that John Keene gets these things, because as we are talking about these, we do have the 30-year agreement out there, so that we can't just impose this. We have to negotiate it. And so if we can show, as Charlie's pointed out, that that's a better benefit over the long haul in recruitment, retention, and in the ultimate benefits, then I think the pension board trustees would be amenable to considering that. I can't speak for them, but we do need to remember that we have another party involved in all this stuff.
To that point, probably defined contribution is not going to be politically acceptable. So again, in the spirit of narrowing options, maybe we take that off the table.
Y'all take off the defined contribution.
The other question is the...
before you... Bob's had his hand up. Right. So.
Bill, I think we're sort of getting far afield here. We're looking at a lot of anecdotal evidence, and we're discussing, as if we know what motivates police officers or fire officers to stay. I feel pretty certain that both the police and the fire chiefs understand what their optimized worker profile should look like. They don't want everybody to be 60 years old, and they don't want everybody to be 20 years old. And my guess would be is that they have a pretty good idea of what motivates people to stay and what part the pension plan plays in that. And if they do have that information, I know they made a presentation to us once, but it would be good to have them come back and try to illuminate us about how that really
Sure.
works.
Well, suppose we did that, though, in the context of modeling these three different, either two or three, I've lost track now. I think is there two?
Mediated, the hybrid.
The mediated and the hybrid, and that was it, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So I think it would be helpful if we saw the turnover percentages as they are now under the current plan and looking at the age bracketing, and then what their recommendations would be, or what their suggested recommendations would be overlaying these plans and what impact they believe they would have on that retention.
Sure, that's a good point. So we will ask them to come back to our meeting, and I'll get with the sheriff and the fire chief. I guess maybe it's the city treasurer. I don't know who that is, but I'll undertake to do that. Okay, Bob? Oh, wait, John, you had a...
I was remembering, and that may be wrongly, but the Atlanta's plan was a hybrid plan, right, for the new employees? Was that hybrid, or was it cash balance? Do we know? Stacked hybrid. Okay.
So, as I understand, we're taking off the table the defined contribution. The two we're going to be considering as for models are the mediated settlement proposal and the hybrid proposal that you've put in here. And Bob was first, then Greg, then Sherry.
Well, I think David could help us a lot on this, but we talk as pensions and deferred income as the sole factor in retention, and I don't think it is.
Mm-hmm.
I think retention is related to leadership, and I think it's related to what their current compensation is, and how we negotiate on pension plan because that's retention. We negotiate on current income and salary because we have to be competitive to get these people and keep them. So these two things have to come together, and I don't think we should deal as a pension plan as the sole factor
right.
in retaining and attracting people.
Sure.
It wasn't that way in private business because upfront money meant a whole lot more to those 25-year-old people than what they were going to get when they were 60.
And historically, when there was negotiations on pensions with municipalities and their public unions, the salaries and all of that was also on the table at the same time because
Which we don't do.
Right.
Greg?
Yeah, when we look at the alternatives, when we're looking at defined benefit, the mediated settlement, which we said was kind of a starting point since it was already negotiated. I think we need to also consider elements of the civic council plan that were different to mediated settlement to see if that's worth considering.
Okay.
And just to me, the two key differences between the mediated settlement plan and the city council proposals are it's really, if you look at that jump at 25 years of service at age 50, and to me, that's the real difference between what the civic council is proposing and what the mediated settlement agreement does. And whether or not that's going to be right for which one would be better for Jacksonville and Jacksonville's goals, up to you, and should be informed from other things about what the task force, what the sheriff and fire chiefs input as well. But to me, that's the core difference.
And the two elements would be the sheriff's and the fire chief's input and the cost of those two.
Well, they're projected to be relatively similar. The cost differences from the civic council's proposal, a lot of it was having to do with making changes to current employees and their current employee accruals, and that's the other big difference between the civic council proposal and the benefit side.
Yeah, a little insight on that. I think you summarized it well. I think the key differences were the civic council said that the normal cost of the MSP proposal was a little bit higher than 10%. So let's get to a 10%. So we have to tweak it a little bit tighter than what's already been proposed. Secondly, it said there is a significant present value savings of addressing not only future employees, but also current employees. I think the True Commission came up with some good recommendations that if you were to consider putting existing employees into a reduced benefit structure going forward, prospectively only, not on any benefits accrued, there is probably some ways you think about doing it at different levels of transition over time. Different age and experience would have a different phase in the numbers. But then it goes with it. I don't think there was a significant focus in the Civic Council on the way that let's defer benefits to a later point in time. I think it was more of a neutrality that says you earn benefits over time. So it would be the council's recommendation that's being discussed here as to whether or not delaying benefits that accrue over time so that they are more backloaded can create a little bit of a monetary handcuff is a good thing and in the interest of all parties.
Right. Chris?
Sure, and I'm just going to point out one other difference I think is important, Mr. Chairman, to the goal of implementing whatever recommendations come out of here. Mediated settlement agreement was exactly that, agreement among the different stakeholders as opposed to just a proposal. So I keep that in mind with the goal of implementation.
Sure.
Just one other comment. I mean, I think, there's a lot of ways to get here. I think the cost that Kristen asked about this is all the same cost. I think it's a difficult concept, how you ask that question. While the costs may all be the same, the expectation for the city varies dramatically between these alternatives, and it's really made transparent when you say, well, look, we don't know if we're going to earn 7%, so let's have a market that goes like this, let's have a market that goes like this, let's have a market that goes like this. The outcomes to the city on cash flows can be dramatically different under these proposals. And so, quite frankly, a defined benefit plan that basically says if you assume 7%, we're guaranteeing that everybody who puts money in the plan is going to earn 7%, and the city's going to underwrite it. And so when you move to a hybrid, you start to share that risk a little bit, right? And so that's the other consideration. I think part of the thinking was, it's a very good observation, I think, that hybrid seems to have a lot of merit. And I think the other place that a defined benefit may have a little bit of legs is in the negotiation strategy as to whether or not it's appreciated by all participants that a defined benefit plan has a different kind of a safety factor than does a hybrid plan. And so one's expectations and one is safety, right? And so that there may be benefits in that. And so I think a little bit of it was, how did the Civic Council think about the fact that we're not in FICA, so we need some kind of non-defined contribution plan? And then what's a level of risk that the city may take? It may actually be the case that markets will deliver more than 7%. But what's the level of risk that the city would bank on as an assumption over the long run that it can make and use its way? So those are some of the other considerations.
Go ahead.
I appreciate all this. This is great discussion. I think the only thing that I'd like to add is that the thing that is increasingly apparent to me is that the workforce that's coming into Jacksonville now fundamentally values things differently than maybe we do. And they don't view turnover in the same way that we did. Most of the people that I know that are coming out of college now think in terms of 4 and 5 and 6 jobs. And that's just not the way a lot of us thought. We thought of working in one place. So one of the things that I would encourage the committee to consider is if somebody wanted to come to Jacksonville and stay here for 4 or 5 or 6 years, does this plan provide an incentive or a disincentive for them? And so throwing out a DC plan right off the bat might not be something that y'all want to consider. That's just my 2 cents.
Just add something. That's a little different, but if you're going to be a professional police officer or firefighter, I mean, the expectation is, it's not like you have a different police department on every block. You have to move, you have to go to another city.
Let's let the sheriff and the fire chief talk to these issues, okay? Kristen?
I was going to say exactly that.
Bill?
Jerry?
So back to these 2 models, I think I heard 2 that you all are going to drill down on. Seems to me, reading everything, listening to this for a while, that a couple of the things that got us into trouble were COLAs and the actuarial assumptions. So as you all build these models, will you help us really understand the role of COLAs and what the assumptions are? going forward so that, some group's not here in 15 years wrestling with the same deal?
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing about COLAs, both for the new employees, but also, I think the mediated settlement, that didn't deal with existing, did that deal with existing employees too, on the COLAs? No, it did not. So I'd like to see what would happen if you eliminated going forward the COLAs for existing employees too.
Or variations there.
Or variations
1%, 2%, 1.5%.
Sure. Maybe maybe doing for the existing employees exactly what the mediated settlement proposal does for future employees. Maybe that's the way to do it.
Well, and we have to examine the impact on workforce.
Sure.
Retention.
Well, that's the whole point, right?
Yeah, and in that vein, if we're looking at a hybrid plan and a defined contribution plan, so that we're asking for shared risk or we're transitioning risk, we also have to look at the income that we're paying our people, because that may not be incentive enough to stick around when they're taking risk for retirement.
Sure. That's right. Okay, so I'm hearing that we're going to model the mediated settlement proposal and the hybrid. We're not going to do the defined contribution. I heard that was off the table. Is that right? So those two, and then with these additions, dealing with the COLAs and somebody else said something else. I don't know who it was. But
Well, just for the sake of review, would it make sense to still have defined contribution on the list just as another analysis point?
any desire to do that?
Because if there is an element of aligning benefits with the public sector to the private taxpayer, so that we're not getting so far from each other that it doesn't make sense. And we certainly in retirement benefits are getting there. But I think it would make sense to compare that retirement benefit while we're also comparing perhaps private sector income, which I know has been brought up, to the public sector income, to give us the full picture.
Okay.
The only thing to keep in consideration, I think, on the defined contribution that I think is a very big point is our police and firemen are not in Social Security. There is no safety net without some kind of a support that comes with a hybrid plan or
Is the defined benefit, does that protect on the Social Security? I mean, you don't have Social Security in that either.
The defined benefit is a guaranteed return. You work, you earn a salary, you get a.
No, I mean the hybrid, I'm sorry.
The hybrid is a mixture of a defined benefit, either cash balance or otherwise.
But Social Security is not a part of that.
No, would it be a defined contribution plus, some portion would be a defined benefit.
Was Social Security absent the analysis? Was it part of the equation?
Yeah, they've been left out of all.
Well, can we add them in?
Yeah.
I mean, that is one difference, I think, where they show with FRS, I think you said, if you were to actually be an FRS, the police and fire would be covered by Social Security.
Right.
Rule. I
That's
think
right.
you said this is,
The provisions of FRS, it doesn't actually include.
But that should be on the table, because that's additional risk we
It's
can
a
take
cost
off
for
of
the
our
city,
budget
right, sure.
and put on to the
Yeah, I
federal
think we
budget.
would be happy to add in, both on the cost side and.
And Mr. Kazubi, the efficacy of doing that with the current workforce versus new hires, and at what point it gets to be a real cost issue, certainly later in the career, it's not an option.
yeah, my concern is when you ask for a lot of work, you get a lot of numbers, and it can become meaningless.
Yeah.
I can drown you in numbers, and you'll get nothing out of it. So I think if you have to get more focused, like, and we can work with you on that, but we can generate, tons of numbers, and it's just too much information.
What about everybody more than 10 years out that would be able to accrue their quarters, being put into Social Security, and what that might look like? I mean, you don't have to do it on every single employee, but give us a big picture idea.
I want to get a sense of what the full committee wants to do about the defined contribution. We want to include it for this purpose to look at, or do we not? Charlie?
I'm guessing, from a private sector standpoint, we all like defined contribution, but I don't know if there's probably at least some of them there, but from a competitive standpoint, I think every other police force, substantially all of them, have either defined benefit or some version of that. I think it would probably put us in a whole different recruitment standpoint by going totally, as much as I prefer that from a financial standpoint.
How do y'all feel? We need to focus, so I want to get your sense, because if y'all want to do it, we'll do it. But if you, now might be the time to cut it out.
The only concern that I have is portability. So what happens if somebody works for us for 7 years, they decide to go to Orlando? Do they take their benefits with them at that point? Or do they stop with us, and how does that work?
On the hybrid?
I can answer that.
Well, let's
Yeah,
let-
with the
let's let
hybrid is
them-
what I'm concerned. Yeah.
On hybrid?
I actually missed the question.
In the hybrid plan, if somebody leaves here and goes to Orlando, do they take any portion of the benefits with them? Because the defined contribution part of it, they would take.
Yeah,
Right.
and they would also be entitled to.
Whatever, the vested. Right. Okay, all right.
Does it make sense to look at Social Security as an alternative of managing risk for an alternative defined benefit component for these employees? Does it make sense? Because what if it's more cost effective?
If y'all want to consider that, that's fine. I think in the real world, we're either going to go with the defined benefit or the hybrid. So I want to try to get us focused on that.
But you can do Social Security while still providing a defined benefit. That's what FRS does. And that's something that FRS is doing because it makes sense. Does it make sense for us to consider that also?
Can I throw something out about that? I mean, if we're talking about 10% contribution to the city plus about 7% for Social Security, 17% of somebody's paycheck is pretty substantial. And I think
it
that
may not be 10 then. That's my point.
Yeah.
Is when you examine what the Social Security contribution to the benefit would be, you don't have to do 17. You might be able to still do 10, but we need to see what it looks like.
Let me, Jim, are there any issues, would we have to do some serious sort of modification? I mean, I know we'd have to have serious modifications, but are there any legal, what would be the legal impact?
Yeah.
Implications. This city, long time ago, opted not to participate in Social Security. That's not possible anymore. Congress closed that door a long time ago. Yes, the city could rejoin Social Security for groups of employees. It probably could only do it for the new hires. It's based on the pension program. It's tied to the pension program. So if you establish a new pension program for new hires, I think that you could, the city could rejoin Social Security under those circumstances. I don't think you could do it like for people with 10 or more years of service or.
Okay.
So it's complicated, but it's, I mean, it's possible.
Okay.
And I think that the city has looked at that option in the context of the settlement agreement and, determined that it was for cost factors and for other reasons not to go down that road. But I mean, it's not undoable.
Okay, thank you. Charlie, you want to say anything else?
My point was, I think you have to change it for the entire city workforce. I don't think you can drill in just to our public safety employees.
No, you can do it separately for police, fire, and general.
So what's the will of the committee? Do we want to go down this path or we not?
I want to,
Great.
because I respect the point that John's
Yep.
making. There is the rate of return you get out of investing in Social Security, which, there's been lots of debate, would you be better off in a private system or not? I think when you think of the model of a defined benefit plus Social Security, wouldn't it be better to think of a defined benefit plus or a cash balance plan plus a defined contribution, a hybrid approach? So, because what you're really saying is, would you rather have employees have access to a defined contribution plan or force them into a Social Security plan? Based upon your views as to what Social Security pays out, you might say, I'd rather have my own investment, relief. What we found when we modeled the benefits assuming 7% returns, you got 3 or 4 times the benefit you get per dollar of Social Security as a final result. So
It's the risk.
it's the risk associated with getting 7%. So if an employee thinks that he could earn a return better than he can get the Social Security, he would prefer to have a defined contribution plan, right? We could avoid the city's risk by just going to defined contribution. So it just feels like because there's so much associated with adopting a Social Security, and that just brings a lot of baggage with it. It feels like that we could get to a similar kind of a risk profile without having to take that step.
So my question again, and John, I'm not denigrating anything. I'm just trying to move us along. And I want to do what the will of the committee is. Do we want to consider this? Y'all have to help me out here.
In negotiating with the fund, I believe we're in a better position if we go with a hybrid plan without the Social Security.
Okay. Is that, can I see some heads either one way or the other? All right, so we're going to not go down that path. Okay. Thank you, John, for suggesting it. I'm really serious about that. That's what we're supposed to be about. Okay, I think we're done on the on the plan design at this point. And we'll have, yes. Oh, Carl, yeah.
I had some on my mind. When I talked about suggested the starting point is the mediated settlement, that settlement does not include current employees.
And that's what we asked to model the current employees on the
So we
COLA.
want to be sure that we include current employees in the model, right?
Right, that's right. To the extent we can.
Yeah, the settlement only increased employee contributions for current employees once they got pay raises.
Right. But if you dropped out the COLAs going forward, and do we want, what about the drop plan? I meant to ask that earlier. What do we want to do about, well, it's in there because that's in the mediated settlement. Right. You're right.
Is the drop plan the same in the mediated settlement as in the Civic Council?
It doesn't touch it for current employees. For future hires, it eliminates the traditional drop plan and puts in more of a backdrop.
So if the intent is to retain people and the drop is a disincentive, why wouldn't we look at it for current employees?
I mean, this is a key thing, even going back to the Civic Council, is right now, and maybe this is where you should go back and start, is the current plan defines retirement after 20 years of service. You can go into drop or retire. The Civic Council plan basically was 25 years. The settlement lets you retire early between 25 and 30 years if there's a penalty.
Right.
So it really is defining a full working career at 30 years.
Right.
That's a big difference.
Yeah.
And I think that's where you have to go back to what is the working career of a police and firefighter, which is obviously different than a general employee.
But we're not going back to the city current plan, we're going to the mediated proposal, and to the extent we can apply, and with the Civic Council, right, and adding existing employees to the extent we can.
Can I make a suggestion?
Yeah.
In these analyses, if there is, because we're saying, okay, what if we do this with the drop, or what if we do this with the contributions, or what if we do this with the age? Can we put price tags on all those things and just sort of, I mean, because we're seeing, I think that's what we need to make, because a lot of these changes too they sound good, but they don't really make a lot of difference.
I think that's where the charts that David had, where you have the value over time of each of these different proposals.
Yeah, but they're all meshed together.
Right.
And I think if we take out the specific portions of those, and then we say, if we revise the COLA, this is how much it's worth. If we revise the drop plan, this is how much it's worth.
You definitely do.
I know.
I was just going to say, the one thing to be careful is, and we have to, is that when you look at everything individually, say you're looking at 6 different things, if you do each one individually, you're going to get one set of results. If you do the first one and then do 1 and 2, you're going to get a different set of results. So you have to kind of prioritize it. A lot of the stuff, for instance, if you change the retirement age, you move the retirement age older, a COLA becomes less valuable because you're going to take benefits.
Right.
So you have to kind of prioritize it. When we price out stuff, if we price out, say, a combination of 7 items and we do it in aggregate, and then we do each one separately, the sum of the 7 is not going to be the sum. And again, it's how you want them looked at will affect the cost.
And the actual cost and today's price tag are often vastly different. We found that with the current drop plan because the expected rate of return was 8.5%, and in theory, the drop plan was free.
Right.
And that has not proved to be the case.
Right.
And so we get back to actuarial assumptions being at the root of all of these issues.
Well, and just going back to the drop, and I think Robert can talk about is, our ongoing work to try to price that accurately. It's very assumption dependent. And, based on what you put into that, and you got a bunch of different reasonable assumptions, you're going to get very different answers on things like that.
Is 7% reasonable?
So it's more of the salary, right?
The salary is a biggie. If you think about it, when somebody goes into drop, you create some benefits. If he's in a position where he's not going to get a pay raise for the next 4 or 5 years, he's not giving up much by going into drop and not having his benefit. But if he's walking away from a 5% pay raise a year, so after 5 years, his salary would be 25 or 30% higher, by going into drop, he's giving out a significantly higher benefit, and the value of drop to him, well, the cost if he goes into drop may actually save money, whereas if he was not going to get any pay raises, drop is very costly.
Well, and not just drop, but looking at the entire plan construct, 7% reasonable because it's a linear assumption we get it every single year, and it's a reality that will never happen. And so we could average 8 and still not meet the obligation, because the average would be 8, but we didn't get 7 every year, and the variability of returns gets us back to where we are. What kind of sophisticated actuarial options do we have to do a better job of projecting our costs?
We're getting more and more complicated, which takes more and more time, but we can use stochastic modeling with it. We do 1,000 models, and it generates rates of return, random number generators.
In a probability or likelihood.
Right, and that's in a way how we're supposed to set the investment assumption. You look at what you think inflation is, you do stochastic modeling of what you think each given asset class is, you come up where you think your 50th percentile is, so over the next, investment people usually look at 10 years, actuaries look at 30 years, and you come up with this rate, and let's just say 7.2%. And what we're saying there is, on average, over the next 30 years, 50-50, that's going to be above 7.2 or below 7.2.
And that's a challenge because you have a 50% chance of success and a 50% chance of failure.
And so then you look at the range, which is 25 to 75%. The range might be 6.5 to 7.8. And based on the modeling, the statistics tell you that 50% of the time you're going to be in the 6.2 to 7.8 range. Still, 50% of the time, you're either going to be too high or too low because the markets are predictable.
Well, can we use a different modeling that would say 75% of these scenarios were successful? Because I know in financial planning, we wouldn't go below that ever. So why are we doing it as a city?
Well, because you're looking at it, it's different when you look at it for a city than for a person, because with a city, you also have different generation of tax. With an individual, he has to have enough money to retire, if that's your goal. If he outlives his money or he doesn't have enough money, somebody has to support him, either his kids or society.
And in this case, it's the taxpayer.
And the question is, you can make it more, if you make it too conservative, the chances are you're front-loading the cost and you're charging today's taxpayers more money than they should pay.
But we've got it so poorly wrong. Isn't that a better thing to do today for now? I mean, isn't that what we're talking about with leveling the costs? Or do we want to go into this with a 50-50 proposition?
Look, I know this may be important, it's way over my head, and we got to be able to explain this. We've got some models that we want to do, and let's just use their expertise and advice, then let's challenge them then when they get back.
Yeah, I think there's a way we can articulate our question. I think our question is we look at these alternative plan designs, and we want to understand with 80% or 75% confidence what our maximum contribution requirement will be over this 30, 20-year period. How are each of these plan designs affected by that, right? And the defined contribution will have a much different line than does the defined benefit.
Right.
And that'll help us inform what's the risk we take, that we're not going to pay $120 million, or we're going to pay a lot more.
And you understand that in 2008, we did have the market events that would be outside your, I don't know, it probably would be outside your 10%, 90% corridor. I mean, it was very unusual. So.
Okay, are we ready to move on?
Yes.
Okay.
Can I make one other comment?
Yes, sir.
Another element. A building block in this process was what to do with the insurance tax premiums and that, and so one aspect of the civic council, we talk about what the differences are, another aspect of the civic council proposal was, it said we need to, with a reasonable assumption, call it 7%, get to a 10% expected cost, but the way that 10% will be paid is 6% by the city and 4% by chapter funds. So it assumes a full dedication of chapter funds.
That's true. The chapter funds are important. We don't need to lose sight of those. Those need to be included in these models. Because that was part of the mediation. Well, It was part of the
No, it
media,
was- there was an
the one
initial
payment,
upfront
the one
contribution.
payment. But that does need to be included, yeah.
Was it?
Let's make sure that in the mediated settlement, it was more than just 1 year. I thought it was just a 1 year.
I think it was 1 year. I think it
Yeah.
was 1 year.
So if you're doing the modeling, you're going to need to clarify that.
There were one-time funds as part of the current balance that's in the enhanced benefit account that came from chapter funds, but we also get 4%. So where we talk about 10% on the cost, you actually have to back that down to 6 to gauge the cost of the MSA.
But that's taking advantage of the chapter funds. That's using the chapter funds, right? Okay, yep, okay. All right, let's talk briefly. What I want to suggest on investment options, on the alternatives, on the investment authority, I think what I'll do is ask John what he's seeking, and so we'll just have that before us. Then we've got David, we've got, I forget who did that, Jonathan did that, so we've got that. So we can, I think we're in a good enough position if we get what John has asked for with the city council, that we can deal with that when we come back together. Is that okay with y'all? Mm-hmm. On the governance memo, did y'all have any, we're about out of time. Did y'all have, to me, that going forward, there do need to be some governance changes. The most prominent of which are the election of the board members and the requirement to use the general counsel. Those would both require charter amendments. And I also sent you around the fees paid, at least for I realized that at the last moment yesterday that that'd be helpful. We don't have a full range of that. But are y'all interested in pursuing those amendments? Are y'all inclined to recommend the investment committee? That's in both
Yes.
John's,
Yes.
okay,
Yes.
all right. I think Gwen wants to make that motion.
You bet.
I think in number 8, that's in the mediated settlement agreement. I think we would want to keep that. We've already taken bankruptcy off the table. The number 9, the conflicts of interest, that is there's some statutory fiduciary requirements there. We might want to, as the recommendation is that we might want to find out how that began and whether it is appropriate to, that really gets to the 3-year collective bargaining is what that's all about. And that is also involved, that also gets to the term of the 30-year agreement. And my sense is that we ought to try to negotiate a reduction of the term of the 30-year agreement. That was certainly in the Civic Council proposal. Charlie?
I thought I had on the 30-year agreement, I understand the importance of that. If we do come up with a way of accelerating the retirement of the unfunded liability, and when I say retirement, in my mind, I'm talking 75 to 80% funded, because there's all kind of assumptions in the calculation of that. It would seem to me, and I understand it's a negotiation, so until the other party agrees, there is no agreement.
Right.
But it would seem to me, as opposed to saying, we want to do away with the 30-year agreement, okay, good luck, that one's, what's the next issue you want to talk about? It seemed to me if I were on the other side. But what if we structure something that says, the 30-year agreement stays in place until we achieve, I'm picking a number, 75% funding. And so we have a way of saying, look, you're relying upon us to keep with our promise to put this money in to retire this debt.
Right.
And as a quid pro quo, for me agreeing with you and the city council 3 years from now, still agreeing to do that, I will agree that once you get me funded up to a certain amount, then I'll agree to let's go to collective bargaining.
Yeah.
But I think that's a fair way, and I don't feel this
That's
party
a good
on the
approach.
side
It's a good
agrees with
idea.
that. That seems like a fair way to get there.
Right, something dealing with the term of the agreement.
Yeah.
But that could extend the term.
It could.
I think it might.
It could. So, I mean, it's a lever on both sides. So get me funded up to the 75%. If you want to delay this thing, we still got an agreement.
Don't want to concede that yet.
The problem is there's so many other variables besides funding on the city's part that affect that from happening. And unfortunately, the risks are mutual. Where the city runs into funding issues is when we go through economic stagnation, is when we go through market challenges. It's when you run into all these other issues that have caused this to be where it is. The market returns are tied right in with our lower tax base. We had poor market returns, and now we've got a lower tax base with real estate pulling back. So the problem is the city takes on more risk in that kind of agreement, in my opinion, rather than achieving something that could be.
I think there's two pieces, though. One is the 30-year agreement, and the other is how is the trustees selected?
The governance
The
issues,
governance
right.
piece of that. I think there's two pieces of that.
What was I going to say? I've gotten your direction on that. I think I know where to go on that.
Let me ask you a question about the trustee issues.
Yeah.
And from